Chapter 14. Beerling in Charge. In 1985, after 28 years at the BBC, they finally put me in charge of their most popular radio channel. Wow. I was thrilled, excited and apprehensive at the job that lay ahead of me. First, to look at the problems facing me as I started. Independent local radio was growing. They had deregulated, so had more or less abandoned their worthy ideas for commercially funded public service broadcasting. At that stage they hadn't discovered the power of joining together to share a common programme, and when they understood how successful that would be, we could expect stronger competition. On the other hand, they had no interest in Radio 1 being privatised, as that would suck away a large proportion of their advertising revenue, so that was a plus for us. Daytime television on BBC and ITV was growing, providing growing competition for audiences too, so there was no room for complacency. Radio 1 was becoming stale and predictable, just what a rock and pop music station shouldn't be, and the average age of the audience was getting older. Although the regular voices were friendly and familiar, we had covered most of the current music trends and we lost the ability to surprise and intrigue the listeners. I had more ideas how to overcome this. We needed a more flexible newsbeat service with news flashes as stories broke. To encourage the producers and DJs to make their programmes and record selection less predictable, to persuade the staff to initiate more original ideas, to reduce the number of oldies we played, to engage with our audience by getting out of London. These were my priorities, so there was more than enough to challenge me as I took over the ropes from Derek that spring. I knew the key to achieving these self-set objectives was to ensure that all the staff understood where I was coming from and to carry them with me, while trying to make life fun for everyone. We were an entertainment station and it should be entertaining to work here. I needed a different management structure. As I'd been doing most of the promotional activity, I wanted an executive producer to replace me and look after the network promotions. Dave Atke came to fill that role, and I made Doreen Davis my deputy. A chief assistant was the person I needed to do the planning and admin. Dave Price fitted this post, and we had to have a couple of executives to manage the programme-making staff. Doreen was just brilliant at managing producers. Jonathan Ruffell gave me an example of her style. One day I went in to see her complaining about my workload, yet after she'd poured me a couple of sherries I walked out, having agreed to take on 2 more commitments. The other half of the equation was the audience. What did they expect of Radio 1 and me? It didn't take me long to find out. One of my first big challenges was to go on Janice Long's evening special, Call the Controller. This gave the listeners an hour of unlimited phone access to me. Over 20,000 people called in, and of course we could only put a small fraction of them on the air. The production team tried to select as wide a range of questions as possible. This gave me a chance to answer their criticisms and to set out my plans for the next few years. It's impossible to please everyone. Many of the callers wanted more of this or that type of music, less chat, others more chat, less pop, more rock, and so on. I took on board what they said and started to get to grips with being a BBC controller. What's the difference between being a controller and a head of department? It's simple. The buck stops with the controller, who is, with few exceptions, responsible for the editorial as well as the administration and managerial aspects of running the whole thing. The head of department only has to worry about the programme-making aspects of his department. I was somewhat surprised and disappointed that the first official reprimand I had to give out was to Simon Bates. I liked Simon. He was a live wire, full of ideas for Radio 1. Soon after I'd got the job, he hit me with no less than 5 suggestions for the network. I replied, "Thank you for your flow of ideas, Simon. Why don't you spend Sunday like the other DJs, mucking out the pigs, getting drunk, checking your pools, or reading the news of the world?" In this first incident, perhaps he was testing me, or perhaps he was just careless. Simon had been monitoring the 0930 news during his programme, and the newsreader read out a story about the bank rate being unchanged for this month. Simon, overcome with glee, turned on his microphone and over the top of the newsreader shouted out, "Whoopee!" But even as the whoopee went out, the newsreader had moved on to the next story, which was all about some poor policeman who had been stabbed and who was currently being given several points of blood to keep him alive. It didn't sound good, and it was quite against the rules to interrupt the news anyway. I had to apologise to the Newsbeat team for what had happened and to make sure there would be no repetition. If I was not to appear a soft touch, I had to come down hard on Simon with a formal letter and make sure that all the other on-air talent knew what I'd done. I'd hardly got my feet under the table when I was summoned by our managing director, Dick Francis. I was a little apprehensive, as I don't think I'd done anything wrong, yet. I had every reason to be grateful to Dick, because his musings in Northern Ireland 6 months earlier had come true, so I guessed that I owed my appointment to his influence. Dick invited me over for a drink after work, and when I'd settled in, he offered me another job which was to outlast my time at Radio 1, and even the BBC. It's still with me today, thanks, Dick. Johnny, you started life as an engineer. What do you know about RDS? Well, frankly, nothing. I've never heard of it, Dick. Well, you soon will. It's a new technology developed by the engineers which has a way of automatically tuning the FM radio to the best signal in an area. RDS will read out on a special display screen the name of the station to which the radio is tuned. There are all sorts of other things in the pipeline, like travel news and text messages and all kinds of other gimmicks. Well, why are you telling me, Dick? I've got enough to do getting grips with learning how to run Radio 1. And for that matter, hasn't the BBC spent enough money on CFAX and launching breakfast television? Why do we have to get into every bloody thing the engineers develop? I'll tell you why, Johnny, because I've committed us to it, and I believe for BBC Radio, RDS has the long-term potential to be as big a development as the invention of the transistor. What's more, we need a programme-making person who understands it to be in charge, to ensure the BBC gets the best out of the system, and to see it's properly promoted. With your background, I reckon you're the one to do it. It was pretty clear that this was an offer I couldn't refuse. I finished my drink and prepared to leave. Oh, by the way, Johnny, I should have told you, it's not just the BBC. This is a European Broadcasting Union-backed project. They have decided all European broadcasters will implement RDS. There's a programme experts group being set up to find the best way of doing it, and you're to be chairman of that too. Well, this conversation was eventually to lead to my becoming chairman of the RDS Forum, a post which I still hold today. My birthday was on April the 12th, and on the 13th I had a wonderful birthday present, the delivery of our very first purpose-built, dedicated suite of Radio 1 studios, all housed in our own building, Egton House. It seems hard to believe, but for all those years, from 1967 to 1985, the DJs and producers had to troop across the road to anonymous studios in Broadcasting House. These had originally been modified from those built for the Home, Light and Third programmes. Now we had a whole floor, branded in a subtle way in our colours of red, white and blue, packed with state-of-the-art equipment. The whole suite had been built to my design after consulting the users, the DJs and the producers. It was a great boost for morale, and all of us were delighted. In 1985, John Peel had proposed an idea to his manager, Clive Selwood, that they should set up their own record label, Strange Fruit. This would provide another opportunity to promote our sessions in the area of music which John and producer John Waters had made their own. There had always been a degree of bootlegging of such recordings, so when Clive came and asked me for a licence to issue these sessions officially, I thought it was a terrific idea. We wanted to give the project maximum publicity, so I agreed to a launch party in our new continuity studios. John, who wasn't a natural extrovert, was prevailed upon to mumble a few words of enthusiasm to the assembled press. These recordings were mainly by bands who were unknown and without recording contracts, but when Clive did eventually get it off the ground with the ambition to launch 4 EPs a month, it was hugely successful. In the first month, 9 tons of vinyl was pressed to complete the orders. With bands like New Order and The Damned, they emerged as stars of Strange Fruit. There was more trouble with Mike Reid to be managed in May. No surprises there then. He was late yet again, this time missing the first 40 minutes of the all-important breakfast show. Doreen was his greatest supporter and bent over backwards to help him, so I decided to let her handle it. Even before this latest incident, she had arranged a special dispensation for Mike, which permitted him to turn up only 30 minutes before transmission. That was instead of the more usual 60 minutes. But he'd been abusing this regularly by often getting there with only 10 minutes to spare. I was all for terminating his contract, but she pleaded his corner on the grounds that he was a star performer and did turn in a good show, and so we gave him yet another chance. This time stipulating that if he wasn't there by 15 minutes before airtime, he wouldn't be allowed on at all. The DJ who was on air before him would continue and do the breakfast show for him. If all this was difficult, things were made worse because someone in Egton House was leaking information. In this case, he or she had given out the story of the row to the Sunday Mirror. "Sorry, folks," says Sleepy Mike. That was the headline. It shook him up for a while, but the leopard doesn't change his spots. Later in the year we rescheduled things so that the breakfast show started at 07:30 on weekday mornings. Even after this concession in August, he was late again. I took him to lunch to try personal persuasion, but at the start of November he missed the first half hour because his car had broken down. I wrote him a final warning on November the 7th. Frankly, I couldn't understand his attitude. Here he was with the biggest breakfast show in the UK, yet he didn't really seem to care enough to get there consistently to introduce it. Early mornings and Mike Reed were just not compatible. After over 4 years of this, I was determined to find a replacement. Once again the leaker went to work, and this resulted in another headline, this time in the Daily Star, along with another story that I was fed up with DJs talking too much, and allowing listeners to do so too when they phoned in. Well, I wasn't too happy that this message had got out, as there was some truth in it. Radio 1 was a music station, and while we expected our DJs to be a friend to the listeners, there was far too much inane, egotistical chat, and not enough about the music. It would be a long struggle to improve this, but I made a start by bringing in Andy Kershaw, a blunt Lancastrian who had been Billy Bragg's road manager. He came to my notice on BBC Two's Whistle Test, and had a great enthusiasm for country, bluegrass, folk and world music. He wanted to share his enthusiasm with the listener rather than enthusing about himself. It was time I got to grips with the DJ presentation. I started a series of suppers, and each week I invited a couple of DJs and their producers along with Doreen and the relevant executive producer to put across my message. I told the DJs and producers there was too much enthusiasm for the old nostalgia and not enough for the new. This gave away their ages. They didn't much care for that message. I didn't want them to treat the music as something that got in the way of their chatter. Talking over the ends of records before they had finished showed a lack of sensitivity, which assumed the public would rather hear their voices than the records they were playing. I wanted less self-promotion, less advertising of themselves, and I wanted the presentation to grow up, treating the audience as adults. I didn't want to hear an endless list of Christian names of people the DJ had met on the previous evening's gig. I expected producers to warn phone-in contestants about this rule when setting up calls. I also expected to hear an increasing emphasis on live music, especially recorded for Radio 1 in the future. That was the message I was preaching, and I guess it took a long while to sink in, but I felt I had made a start. I knew we were suffering from the very system that had benefited my own career. Producers in the BBC in those days had jobs for life. Hence it was that the average age of my team of producers was greater than those in Radio 2. Long-serving producers, with a few notable exceptions, were set in their ways, and not always the most enthusiastic when it came to an awareness of new musical trends or new methods of working. If I was to get things changed over the next few years, these dyed-in-the-wool older ones would have to be eased out and replaced by younger ones on shorter contracts. Another of my ambitions was carrying the biggest and best concerts, and in July we were able to realise the biggest when we agreed to broadcast Live Aid. It was one of the best days of my life in Radio 1 and one of my proudest moments. Not just because of the enormity of the project and the great music that we were able to broadcast, but because of the way our listeners contributed and helped with the fundraising to relieve some of the suffering in Africa. July the 13th, 1985. That was the day of the Live Aid concert. It was a fine summer, and all those months of planning with Bob Geldof and the controller of BBC Two, Alan Yentob, came to fruition. At 12 midday, Richard Skinner made the opening announcement. "It's 12 o'clock in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia. Welcome to Live Aid." Status Quo leapt on stage. "Are you all right?" and launched into rocking all over the world. We started with two big shows, one in Wembley and later another one at the JFK Stadium in Philadelphia. During the afternoon there were live link-ups too for concert performances from Germany, from Yugoslavia, Holland, Japan, Austria and Russia. Long before we had reached this stage, many internal battles had been fought behind the scenes. The first big one was political, about how much the BBC is able to solicit for funds for charity using its own airwaves. Geldof had said, "If we can't appeal for funds in Africa, there's no fucking way you're going to get the rights to broadcast this show." Yentob and I had been to see the Deputy Director General, Michael Checkland, to sort this one. Much debate and soul-searching went on before it was finally agreed we could give the phone number on screen and over the airways and solicit money for the starving in Ethiopia. Next there was a major problem over the sound mix. Traditionally, BBC television engineers guarded their right to mix their own sound for television broadcasts, and they were not at all happy at the idea that Radio 1 sound engineers were going to mix the output for them to share. This too was eventually resolved, and they reluctantly agreed to take our sound feed from the big stage for the music and do their own thing for off-stage interviews and supporting features. On the day the weather was perfect. The sun was shining. The crowd were emotional and expectant. It was a perfect day. The atmosphere was just wonderful as a succession of stars took their turn to perform. Everyone was really putting everything into their performances, and it was hard to single out anyone for praise. Bob Geldof was obviously there with the Boomtown Rats. Phil Collins performed in London, then set off in Noel Edmonds' helicopter to catch Concorde so that he could make a second appearance later in the show live from Philadelphia. At 5 p.m. the Philadelphia stage came live, and Jack Nicholson introduced Bryan Adams. U2 played in Wembley, then the Beach Boys in Philadelphia, and so it went on. Nearly 2 billion people were now watching all over the world. Roger Daltrey and the Who reformed. They were topped by Queen, who got the whole 72,000 audience singing along "We Are the Champions." Things were going pretty smoothly backstage too, considering the complexity of the operation. We had a revolving split stage. It was in 3 parts, one on the air, one about to go on air, and one being de-rigged after the previous band had finished. These were wired to 2 identical sound mixing trucks, so that while one set of microphones were being used to broadcast the band currently on air, the other half stage, out of sight, was being rigged for the next band to appear. Our producers, Jeff Griffin and Chris Lysett, with executive producer Stuart Grundy and 2 studio managers, Dave Dade and Mike Robinson, were working flat out, and the afternoon passed in a noisy and happy, if frantic, whirl. In charge of the television simulcast was another old friend, Mike Appleton, who'd been responsible for the Old Grey Whistle test and many in-concert simulcasts. He and Jeff had worked together many times and luckily got on very well. During the studio interviews between acts, Geldof appeared frequently to make his appeal, "Give us your money." As darkness fell in London, David Bowie was on, and then Billy Connolly introduced Elton John, who was joined by George Michael. They sang "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me." We were building to the climax in London. John Hurt introduced Freddie Mercury, who was accompanied by Brian May, for a special song, "The World We Have Created." And then we had our first hint of technical trouble after 9 hours on the air. Freddie's mic was not working as well as it should, and technical talkback from the technicians was radiated in error. Then as Freddie ended his song, the stage faded to black. There was an air of expectancy as the lights came up on a stage where 2 Live Aid logos of guitars were superimposed on an outline of Africa. A solo piano started to play, and as the darkness descended, the crowd roared because they saw Paul McCartney. Paul had decided to open with "Let It Be," and as the band started, the biggest major glitch of the day occurred. Paul's microphone wasn't working. Oh, horror! It had to happen to him of all people. The engineers rushed round and finally found the plug for the silent microphone, and we finally heard Paul's vocal after an agonizing 1 minute and 45 seconds. It felt like an eternity. As Bob Geldof said in his closing announcement from the stage, "If you're going to have a cock-up, it may as well be in front of 2 billion people." The London show ended with the entire cast on stage singing "Feed the World." It was probably the greatest showcase of popular music that there ever was. There's a nice postscript which not many people know about. Although the BBC only had the rights to broadcast the live concert, Jeff Griffin had, unknown to most people, recorded the entire show on 16 tracks. He did this just in case the organisers ever wanted to do anything with the tapes, in the event that they could negotiate for the highlights to be commercially released. A few days after the show, Paul McCartney went into his Air studios and recorded the missing vocal onto the tape so that the missing lines could be mixed in. And that's how it is that the DVD that got issued just sounds wonderful. You can't please everyone, even with a concert like that. One miserable bugger phoned in to grumble that we had deferred the regular broadcast of our documentary series, The Story of Rock. Gary Davis took the call and told the listener, "Live Aid is the history of rock in the making." Exit disgruntled complainer. To keep with my idea of broadening the music, I brought in Rankin Miss P, a black DJ who'd been making a name for herself on a London pirate radio station as an expert on reggae music. She had an hour after Robbie Vincent did his regular Sunday 2-hour evening slot covering the best of soul and funk music. On the internal politics front, it was customary for different programme controllers to attend one of the regular meetings of the Board of Governors with the Board of Management, and one was invited to join them for lunch after the meeting. With 5 radio controllers and 2 television ones, it meant the opportunity didn't come round too often. However, when it did, I found it fascinating to sit in and observe the 2 boards in action. One was expected to make a report on what was happening in one's channel, highlighting outstanding achievements and answer questions. After I'd done my piece about Live Aid, I had a good old moan about how stupid it was that the channel with the largest audience of young people shut down at midnight and didn't open till 6 a.m. I grumbled that when it was on the air, the audience couldn't hear it properly because we weren't in FM in stereo like the other networks. My ambition was to be on FM for 24 hours a day. It was interesting then to sit back and see who would be interested enough to ask questions. Keith Oates, who had been the financial director of Marks and Spencer's and who had teenage children, was one of the few governors who'd actually heard any of the Radio 1 output. He was always interested, as was Watson Pete, the Scottish National Governor. Bill Jordan, on the other hand, was the union representative, and with his background should have known what we were about, but he wasn't in the least interested, nor were many others, mainly, I guess, because they never listened. After the main business was concluded, the chairman would round off the meeting by asking the governors if they had any general comments about programmes on TV or radio. The most amusing moment came when Sir John Boyd, who'd been the General Secretary of the AUEW, spoke up about Dennis Potter's play Pennies from Heaven. "Mr. Chairman," he said in his broad Scottish accent, "my wife and I watch with interest the latest play for Mr. Potter, and where we're not prudes, we were very shocked to see a scene in which a naked man was on top of a woman making love, and the woman was clearly having an organism. Was it really necessary to show such a thing?" There were muffled guffaws from several members of both boards, and Dukey made some non-committal reply about artistic integrity before he closed the meeting, and we moved off for lunch. Back at the coalface, I was able to persuade Noel Edmonds to come back and sit in for a week on his old breakfast show while Mike Reid was away on holiday. Noel, in his pre-launch comment, made a typical if barbed comment at Mike Reid's expense. I aim to do what Mike normally does, turn up late and throw on a few records. That 1 week was a huge success, but all too soon it came to an end. There had been terrific publicity and huge demands for his earlier knickknacks, welly stickers and Fiona fairies. Next time Mike Reid was away, I brought back Mike Smith, who by now had outgrown his love affair with breakfast TV. I wanted to see if he was still as good as I had remembered him. He was. It was back to Dallas in September to attend another NAB convention. On my return, I found a huge can of worms waiting for me. I began to realize what pressure one could come under as a controller. So big was this can that I thought my tenure as controller might be the shortest on record. It had been obvious to me for some time that Radio 1's public involvement in any commercial activity did add value to it and did increase attendance. In the past, our approach had always been to ask the promoter to calculate the size of that added value and give that sum to a charity of our choice. Over the years, we'd raised nearly £1 million for different charities. In June, Princess Anne had opened the Children's Hospital in King's College, where we had financed a Radio 1 ward. I was of the opinion charity begins at home, and we were short of cash to do more promotional things associated with music. I argued that if Radio 2 and 3 could make money from their involvement with public concerts, the proms for instance, it should also be possible for us to do the same. It couldn't be seen as sponsorship because we wouldn't go into any project with profit as the motive. My aim was to establish a Radio 1 public events fund, which I could use to support other concerts for broadcasts in areas where they might not be commercially viable. My proposal was that, in future, we should calculate the added value, deduct the costs of our involvement, and share the balance between charities as before and a new Radio 1 events fund. I outlined my thoughts in a paper for the Deputy Managing Director, Charles McClelland, who thought long and hard before giving me the go-ahead to try it out. In April, I had a proposal from Tony Wilson. He was our expert rock music producer. He suggested that as I was keen to broadcast the biggest and best concerts, I should put this scheme in operation in his field, rock music. He had a contact, Paul Loseby, who was about to promote a major rock concert at Nebworth, so why didn't we set up a meeting to see if we could work out a deal with him by which we could all be involved? We set up the meeting with Loseby, Stuart Grundy, the rock music executive producer, Dave Atke, our promotions executive, and Tony Wilson, where we thrashed out the details. We agreed in return for all broadcasting rights we would call the event the Return to Nebworth Fair. On the bill would be Deep Purple, Alaska, Blackfoot, Mama's Boys, and the UFO, with DJs Tommy Vance and Richard Skinner presenting on stage and on Radio 1. It would take place on the 22nd of June and would be promoted by Radio 1 in association with Paul Loseby, this wording to be used in all on-air trailing, on all posters and advertising. Regarding the added value cash, it was calculated on a sliding scale. For an audience of up to 80,000 people, the cash would be 30,000, and 5,000 more for every 100,000 more people. These sums to be split between a charity and our events fund. Loseby agreed to these terms, and the promotional build-up started in May. The night before the show, Friday the 21st of June, Tony Wilson did his Friday rock show live from Nebworth, with Tommy Vance reflecting the following day's activities. On the Saturday, Tony's team recorded the entire concert performance on multitrack for later transmission. The weather wasn't kind, and I flew in by helicopter. From the air, to me it resembled a scene from a Vietnam War film as we came out of low cloud into a very dull, drizzly day. There was smoke rising from campfires, and bedraggled heavy metal fans were making their way to the arena as the PA systems throbbed away with a heavy bass beat. No rockets, but these were to come in my direction very shortly. Maybe the bad weather was responsible for the lower-than-predicted attendance, which was far below the promoters' expectations. I don't know what the final figure was, but it didn't make the 80,000 number, so we were owed the minimum, as per the agreement, £30,000. Paul, the promoter, went sick through exhaustion and stress, and we couldn't get in touch with him until mid-August, when we finally had a meeting, at which we agreed to reduce the sum he owed us because of the reduced attendance. The company through which he promoted the concert had gone into liquidation, though he did manage to pay us £10,000 on account. It was better than nothing, though it would hardly cover the expenses we'd incurred, so there was little left over of my events fund or any charity. As far as we were concerned, there was nothing untoward about the arrangement, except we had a shortfall. Somehow the other creditors of Paul Loseby had heard that we had collected some of what we were owed, while they had received nothing. It was inevitable that the press became aware of it. Whoever told them, the News of the World had a wonderful time exposing "Scandal as the BBC takes 25,000 for running pop adverts." And a week later, "The BBC, Britain's biggest cover-up." Most of the facts were incorrect, but the BBC was embarrassed, and Charles McClelland and I were up before the Deputy Director General Mike Checkland and the BBC's legal adviser Tony Jennings. Tony, having heard the facts, concluded that we were technically in breach of Clause 12 of the BBC's licence and charter. This prohibits payment for advertisements or sponsored programmes without the express permission of the Home Secretary. Michael Checkland understood what I had been trying to do and sympathised with my objectives, but concluded that we had no alternative but to hand the £10,000 back to Lowsby. Poor old Charles, he was summoned to a BBC Board of Governors meeting, which that week was being held in Scotland. He had to explain the circumstances surrounding the problem and how it had arisen. Charles, fortunately, was good at late-night drinking, and after a few tinctures with the chairman, Stuart Young, they didn't give him too rough a ride at the board meeting on the following day. I still didn't understand the difference between what we had done and what was going on in Radio 2 and 3, except we had a much higher profile. The BBC was under the eye of the Peacock Committee, which was conducting an inquiry into the BBC's funding. It was always my view that the BBC needed to help itself by making money where it could. In later years it did just this by expanding BBC Enterprises, which became BBC Worldwide. Maybe it was time for a remit of some of the terms of the original licence, but that was certainly outside my limit. At this time the BBC was paying about £5 million a year to Phonographic Performance Limited for the use of records on network and local radio, television and external services. Radio 1's share of that was £1.5 million, or about £410 an hour. If you reckon on 15 discs in an hour, this was costing about £27 a play. If you add onto this the performing rights fees, PRS, which amounts to another £31 per disc, you can see it was costing us £58 for every disc we played on Radio 1. Over and above this, I had a budget of about £1.1 million to spend on programmes. This had to pay for all those programmes made by Radio 1, Newsbeat, Talks, as well as all the publicity, hospitality and staff expenses. When I took over, we had 7 million listeners every day who were tuned in for about 2.5 hours. In any week, audience research calculated that we reached 19 million people. We were the most listened to station in the UK, despite not being on FM. If you took our budget and divided it by the number of listeners, it worked out at about 1.5p each per week. That wasn't bad value for money. At the BBC, we considered the future of our annual Music Awards ceremony. Radio 1 and BBC Television had been involved with the British Rock and Pop Awards for a few years now, with Nationwide and the Daily Mirror. There were other music award ceremonies going on in parallel, so several people in the music business got together to see if there was a better way forward. We settled on one show, the BPI Awards, with BBC Radio 1 and BBC Television. That later became known as the Brits. It's still going today, though with ITV rather than the BBC, but that was the birth of it. I'd heard on the grapevine that the Home Office had told the BBC that within a couple of years sufficient space could be cleared on the FM band to squeeze in another national network. If the money could be found within a couple of years, we might finally get our Radio 1 FM stereo outlet. I had to do some serious lobbying as soon as possible. I had another plan too for the broadcasting of our service. I wanted to get it up on the Sky satellite, and had been making some discreet inquiries about the cost and practicability of doing this. If we could do it, then we could be in with a service that had a footprint covering the whole of Northern Europe. Word got back to Alistair Milne, the Director-General, and he wasn't pleased, and word was passed back to me, keep your nose out of it. It seems the BBC was in quiet negotiations with ITV about setting up a Best of British service delivered by satellite, and my intervention might jeopardise this. There was a lot of secrecy about it, and I couldn't find out if there was any chance of Radio 1's output being included in the Best of British. I reckon that distribution by satellite would be increasingly important in the future. I thought Radio 1 should be a worldwide brand, and I was concerned that it wasn't being marketed to maximum advantage abroad. Traditionally, all BBC recorded material had been offered to overseas broadcasters through the BBC transcription service. Problem was that this organisation had been set up as a subdivision of the BBC Overseas Service back in the days when there was a British Empire. It was part of the BBC's duty to provide embryonic broadcasters with quality programmes at an affordable cost. It was never foreseen that commercial product like Radio 1 sessions and concerts by big-name artists would be on offer. Through blanket deals between Transcription Service and Commonwealth Broadcasting Organisation, they could put out hours of very commercial music with no revenue or kudos coming back to us. In any case, if we could have acquired more money, there was no mechanism for transferring funds from the overseas coffers to domestic radio. The BBC Overseas Service was funded by a government grant in aid, and not via the licence fee. London Wavelength had been the previous American company distributing our products in the States, and it was they who had a deal with the BBC Transcription Service, which I reckon they got very cheaply. I was looking for something better. In America, a man called Norm Pattis owned a large programme syndication service called Westwood One. I suggested to Norman a proposal for a different type of arrangement. He would offer a large sum of cash as an advance against royalties for a 1-year deal. We obviously couldn't take the cash as money, but he would use it to support the costs of our UK productions, documentaries and concerts. This would free up more of my programme allowance. In return, he would have the rights to use any of our programmes, either as whole programmes or cut up into items, on American radio. We would also have free access to any of the programmes produced by Westwood One, including many big concerts which they recorded by world-famous acts. We would get a much higher profile in America, and everyone would benefit. It was a good idea, but it didn't happen due to the BBC's inability to cut through all the existing systems and the red tape. We did, however, secure a deal via the transcription service based on similar lines. Although Radio 1 never saw the cash benefit, we did gain access to some more big-name concerts under the banner American Bandstand. These started in 1986, and Radio 1 shows had a much higher profile in North America. Live Aid had been broadcast in July, and Simon Bates came to me with a proposal that we should do a follow-up programme, Live Aid Shareholders Report. The purpose would be to keep that project alive in the minds of our listeners and see where the money raised had been spent and what good it was doing. It was a good idea, and I put Stuart Grundy, one of our executive producers, in charge of making it work. Stuart and Simon went away to Ethiopia and the Sudan for nearly 3 weeks, living rough while collecting some very moving material, filing reports daily into Andy Peebles' show in the evenings. They even managed to get themselves locked up for a couple of nights by some over-enthusiastic militia in Tigray. Working with Oxfam, they managed to gain additional publicity by persuading pop personalities to undertake a day of fast in sympathy with the starving. UB40, Paul Young, Fergal Sharkey, Howard Jones and Depeche Mode all agreed to starve for a day. When Stuart and Simon returned, they put it all into a special programme, skillfully blending actuality, music and carefully crafted links from Simon, which I thought was terrific. I wrote and told them so. This was Radio 1 doing the sort of talk that would appeal to its audience in a way other networks were not doing, and epitomised the approach I wanted to hear on Radio 1. Without being stuffy, we were starting to sound grown up. I had to issue another reprimand to Simon Bates following several complaints that he'd seen the Pope at several gigs. Simon, it's come to my notice that you are taking in vain the name of His Holiness the Pope. I've had a complaint from the head of religious broadcasting. You really should not allege that the Pope was at the Sting concert or the reception afterwards. If there's any repeat of this, I shall be looking for a puff of black smoke from the chimney in your studio. We finally got to grips with Mike Reed's future on The Breakfast Show. By Easter he would have been on it for 5 years and 4 months, so we agreed on a statement to the effect that he had too much work to continue getting up every morning and would be leaving after Easter. He had Superstore on Saturday mornings, plus his work on the Guinness Book of Hit Singles, as well as a musical on the poems of John Betjeman in preparation, so he would be moving to Sunday mornings on Radio 1. Mike Reed's replacement would be Mike Smith, who had loads of fresh ideas to give the breakfast show a kick-start. He introduced the BAT, the Breakfast Access Telephone, through which the public could make regular contributions, a Get Your Own Back feature which gave students a chance to report on their teachers, shades of the Not Very Good Club if they weren't very careful, and Chartbeat, where listeners could vote on 10 of the best new discs. Mike had hardly settled in when he went off to Montreux to broadcast the show, where he was doubling up on the BBC's reportage of another TV festival. We benefited, though, as Mike managed to get us interviews with stars who were appearing there, including David Bowie, Elvis Costello, Annie Lennox, Francis Rossi and Roger Daltrey. Some of the long-serving DJs were giving the same problems as the long-serving producers, yet they were still very popular with their audiences. I was concerned that we should be developing new talent like Simon Mayo. Simon had come to us from BBC Radio Nottingham. BBC Local Radio was not a natural breeding ground for Radio 1 DJs, nor was local commercial radio. I wrote a piece in the trade paper Music Week in March. Where is the new DJ talent? Why is it, after all these years of BBC and independent local radio and the expansion of broadcasting hours, that there are so few really good people knocking on the doors of Radio 1? To highlight what I meant, I commissioned a new series, Radio, in which the careers of 6 outstanding and unique DJs were put under the microscope. The DJs were Noel Edmonds, Kenny Everett, Tony Blackburn, Paul Gambaccini, John Peel and Steve Wright. I broadcast it in the hope it would inspire new original talent to come forward. Now, looking backwards, in 1786 the first male coach had carried the post from York to London. In 1986, 200 years later, Simon Bates with producers John Leonard and Roger Lewis were to recreate that run on a genuine stagecoach owned by Norwich Union, drawn by 4 horses, driven by John Parker. The trip took 9 days. The crew were sent off on May the 24th by the Lord Mayor of York, who gave them a scroll to deliver on arrival in London. They were escorted by a team of Variety Club helpers with collecting buckets so that spectators could contribute as the coach passed by. Simon did his daily show live from the front seat of the coach and also managed live inserts into many other Radio 1 programmes. I was rowed in to do my bit when Simon bet me I couldn't run 6 miles alongside them. I joined them at the old coaching inn, the George at Stamford, and managed to get myself sponsored by all the major record companies. As I was running in front of the coach, I had to keep going or they would have run me down, a cheap way to get rid of the controller. In all I raised £4,000 towards the grand total of £50,000 they raised for Sport Aid. I'll never forget the sight of the coach driving in front of Buckingham Palace as they made their way on June the 2nd to the Mansion House in the City of London. There they were greeted by the Lord Mayor of London and received a scroll on completion of the trip. It was great fun. It made excellent programming and generated tremendous publicity for Radio 1 in the press and on television. Also in London, the major event of the 86 summer was the wedding of Prince Andrew to Sarah Ferguson. We decided to cover it in our own way by taking Smithy and an extended breakfast show to the curbside as the parade went by. We negotiated with the ICA for a position on their roof in the Mall, where we set up our DJ desk. It was a good summer day, plenty of sunshine. Mike was at the controls, helped by Janice Long and Gary Davis. They had radio mics in the crowd. That way we could reflect the atmosphere and give our listeners a feel for the fun of the spectators. Soon after this, Simon Bates, Chris Longley and I flew to Australia to collect a Pater Award from celebrated veteran broadcaster John Laws. This was at a prestigious ceremony in the Sydney Opera House. As we flew out, Simon was on top form. We'd already been given an upgrade to business class on our British Airways flight, and after dinner, Simon Bates summoned our flight attendant. "My dear chap, my friends and I really enjoyed that Australian white wine you served with our dinner. Where might we buy a similar bottle?" "Oh, please, Mr. Bates, do accept a bottle each for you, Miss Longley and Mr. Beerling, with our compliments." "Well, that's very kind, thank you so much," said Simon. We had a crew change in Dubai, and blow me if Simon didn't try the same trick again on the next leg of the flight. On the way home from Australia, I was putting the final touches to a document for David Hatch, the managing director, about the future of Radio 1. As I saw it, there were two options. Either we could retreat to attracting the under-18 age exclusively, or we could stay with the current large audience of people who thought they were young. If we took the former course, it could be argued we were providing a unique service by catering for a young audience that was not of any interest to commercial advertisers. At that time, boss David Hatch decided we should continue as we were and keep the large audience we already had, while broadening the range of music, news, entertainment and social action. That decision to keep the large audience was the most significant one we made, although none of us appreciated that at the time. Chapter 15. It's music radio, John, but not as we know it. We were apprehensive that the forthcoming report from the Peacock Committee would recommend that the BBC should sell off Radio 1 and 2 or fund it through advertising. All my efforts at this time were directed at demonstrating the difference between us and commercially funded stations. We did this by playing a wider range of music, live and off-record, improving the literacy of the DJs, putting out an educative series of documentaries and social action campaigns, and providing a news service specifically aimed at our audience. I reinforced what I was doing by giving a series of interviews in The Times, The Guardian, Broadcast Magazine and some of the music trade papers. How adverts would change the sound of Radio 1, that was my theme. I said that rock and pop music was often confused with commerciality, but it had to be self-funded because it never received any funding from the Arts Council. That didn't mean it had no aesthetic qualities. I argued that the last 20 years since the 1960s has seen the emergence of some of the most creative and stimulating popular music ever. Songs reflecting social change and the preoccupations and views of the young people had emerged from the likes of Bob Geldof, Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, Mick Jagger, Pete Townsend, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. With this range of music on offer, it ought to be made readily available via the radio. Young people had as much right to hear the diversity of their musical culture as those who listened to BBC Radio 3. Public service radio in the shape of Radio 1 had a duty to provide this, especially when there was so much unemployment and many of the potential audience couldn't afford to buy records. If Radio 1 went all out for audiences to please the advertisers, then much of what I had described would be lost forever. We were all trying to influence Peacock. A series of 7 documentaries were produced for us by Radio 4. This was another first. They were called You'll Never Be 16 Again, and they were a sort of chronological study of youth culture from the 1940s through to the present time, illustrated with music. On a more down-to-earth level, there was trouble again with Mike Reid, now broadcasting on Saturday evenings at 7:30. Once again he was late for the start of his show. I was tearing my hair out. Luckily I had a fair amount to tear. Not only did he miss it because he was stuck in traffic on the A3, but he tried to set up an arrangement with the technical operator whereby he could introduce the first few records from his car phone. It sort of worked when they tried it out before going on air, but when it came to the start after the 7:30 news summary, somehow the phone had become disconnected and there was silence on air. The technical operator played an emergency standby tape. Unfortunately, it was the wrong one. This was only to be used in the event of a major tragedy, so listeners heard some dirges for what seemed a very long time. What a mess-up. Out of 21 DJs on the network, why was Mike Reid the only one who was regularly late? Doreen Davis wrote to him and his agent a very heavy letter, but I was as upset as he was. Mike was a talented broadcaster, good for the network, but bloody unreliable. If those internal problems weren't enough, in July the long-awaited Report of the Committee on Financing the BBC, the Peacock Report as it was known to us, was delivered to Parliament. They came to the conclusion that for the time being the BBC should continue to be supported by a licence fee, though this should be tied to the retail price index. In the long run, they said, the licence fee system ought to be replaced by subscription. In the short term, where households were solely dependent on a state pension, they should have the fee waived. Personally, I think we missed a trick here by not responding with the offer of a cost-saving measure. There was a rumour that Alistair Milne, the Director-General, was prepared to sacrifice Radio 2, but the rest of the Board of Management opposed him, so no major cuts in services were made. I would have made a compromise proposition whereby we retained our position as the instrument of national radio broadcasting while leaving the commercial sector to look after the interests of local radio. This way we would have saved the huge costs of BBC local radio and avoided competition for national audiences. But no, the philosophy pursued by Alistair Milne was that the BBC had to be in everything. Universality, even if it meant spreading the butter very thinly. I would have preferred a more generous helping of butter on fewer slices. As it was, the government rationed our butter via an index-linked licence fee. To my relief, I noticed they had discussed the selling off of Radio 1 and 2, but didn't agree that we should be funded by advertising, because of the disastrous effect this would have had on the existing commercial sector. The other significant recommendation was that 40% of our programmes ought to be made by independent producers. This we agreed to, though later the target was modified to 25% for television and around 10% for radio. I took some comfort from this quote. There will be a distinct and important role for the BBC as far ahead as anyone cares to look, not only in the field of public service programmes in the narrow sense, but in the wide field of entertainment, information and education. I reckon that fitted in with what I was trying to do with Radio 1. I argued that we did make popular entertainment in that wide field. All I had to do was to convince the doubters that this was true. What I'd not realised was that there were still doubters inside the BBC. We were pleased with the work being done by our new press officer, Jeff Simpson. Jeff had noticed that much of the existing press was about the DJs, their activities and hobbies, rather than about Radio 1. Jeff devised a strategy whereby he would seek to concentrate on stories about Radio 1, its music, its grown-up approach, and its social action. Thus, when Simon Mayo took over the breakfast show, Jeff placed stories about the newer breed of intelligent, well-educated presenters with university backgrounds. They were epitomised by Nicky Campbell and Simon Mayo. He was trying to erode the old smashy and nicey image which had been attached to much of what we did. Star producer Kevin Howlett made a pilot programme for his new Saturday afternoon show, The Stereo Sequence. This would expose the best of today's music at a time when we had the FM stereo transmitters on Saturday. The programme was excellent. The producer Kevin had chosen was Johnny Walker, and I decided it was time to have Johnny back. He'd been away for nearly 11 years. The new show was one of the highlights of my schedule for the year 1986. I knew from research that 70% of our listeners on Saturday afternoons were over 25, so Johnny was able to play grown-up music from albums and CDs. It was a success from the beginning, and Walker was as good as ever. Smithy was doing good business since he took over the breakfast show. Over 500,000 new listeners were tuning in, and we had a weekly reach of 18 million listeners. I decided we should make one more good publicity broadcast at the end of the year. Mike Smith would take 4 youngsters to Rovaniemi in Finland in search of Father Christmas, from whose home he would broadcast his breakfast show. Chris Lysett, who was producing, managed to tie in with Finnair, and they offered flights for the team, including several of our secretaries, to chaperone the prize-winning children. We promoted it via a competition in which the children had to write out why they wanted to meet Father Christmas. There were obviously thousands of entries, and we could only take 4 children. So the 10 finalists were invited to London for an eliminating interview. It was tricky to choose the winners because they had to be articulate and old enough to go away without their parents, yet young enough to believe in Father Christmas. Eventually the 4 were chosen and set off on what was to be a magical trip. On arrival at the airport, they were called to the information desk. Chris, being a good dad as well as a good producer, had set things up well. On arrival at that information desk, the party was given a message carved into a piece of wood.
"Oh, sorry I can't be there to meet you as I'm very busy with my reindeer, but we'll meet later. Have a good time." Signed, Father Christmas.
Chris, Mike Smith and the girls took the children off to their destination, a fairy tale setting of a log cabin by the side of a frozen lake. Behind the cabin was a corral which contained 2 reindeer and a board showing their names, and each day more and more reindeer appeared in the corral, but still no Santa. One evening, as they looked out after tea across the frozen lake, the children spotted a red lantern moving on the far bank. They were more and more excited at the imminent arrival of the man himself. Chris and Mike built the tension, so that he didn't actually arrive until the last half hour of the final live programme, just as the disappointed children were packing their bags to leave. In came Santa, full of apologies as he'd been so busy as it was 2 days before Christmas Day. In that last half hour he fulfilled every child's dream of Santa Claus. It was wonderful radio, and it had an interesting spin-off. One of the winners was Mary, who came from Stirling in Scotland. A year after it was all over, Mary's mum wrote to Chris Lycett saying, "You'll never realise what a difference that trip made to Mary's life. Before it she wasn't very gregarious, and her ambition was to be a librarian. Now she's decided she wants to be one of Pan's people. I wonder if she ever made it as a dancer." Thursday, April the 29th, 1986, was a momentous day for us all. We were shocked when the Director-General was fired. Alistair Milne had been there for 4 years, during which time there had been numerous rows, a very public libel case which the BBC had lost, and he was facing allegations of incompetence, of wasting the licence fee money, as well as accusations of political bias. While these were not all true, what was inescapable was that he was an impatient man who brooked no arguments and was not very subtle when it came to dealing with politicians or BBC governors. Chairman Duke Hussey was not impressed. There had been a meeting of the Board of Governors, and after the business had been concluded, before lunch, Dukey sent for Alistair, where he and Joel Barnett, the Vice-Chairman, asked for his resignation. "We want you to leave immediately. This is a unanimous decision of the Board." Alistair didn't really have much choice faced with that. He wrote it out, and at the lunch Duke Hussey tapped his wine-glass to attract the attention of those present. "The Director-General will not be joining us for lunch today. He is leaving." So that was that. Alistair out, and Michael Checkland, who'd been Deputy DG, in as Acting Director-General. I was at the centre of another high-profile row in May 1986 when CBS brought out a George Michael single, "I Want Your Sex." Bearing in mind that George Michael has a very big fan following among girls in their teens and sub-teens, I couldn't see how we could put out a song that had the lyric, "Sex is natural, sex is good, not everybody does it, but everybody should. Don't you think it's time you had sex with me, etc. every morning over the cornflakes?" Well, radio goes into people's homes uninvited, and I had visions of irate dads and mums complaining in their thousands. I debated with my team, and we decided to restrict the playing of it to after 9 p.m. I knew this would give the record company a great marketing ploy, but there was nothing more to do. There were headlines. Indeed, the Star made it their lead story, "Outrage over George's new record." But I did get some support from an unexpected quarter, when the Sun wrote an editorial. "It's sense. Radio 1 boss Johnny Beerling is dead right to keep George Michael's single, 'I Want Your Sex' off the air until 9 p.m. There may be songs around with nastier lyrics, but this one could hardly be more sexually explicit. It's not censorship. The record can still be played between 9 p.m. and midnight, so it's sheer common sense." I had reviewed our schedule in 1987, and while the impression may have been given of a pop and prattle station, it just wasn't true. Apart from Johnny Walker's 5.5-hour stereo sequence, there was Janice Long mid-evening, playing a wide selection of contemporary music, Jeff Young doing a 3-hour dance music show, Andy Peebles with 2 hours of airtime covering soul music, Andy Kershaw playing his own selection of world music, Robbie Vincent with jazz funk, the Friday Rock Show presented by Tommy Vance, and Ranking Miss P, who'd come in from a pirate radio station in London doing a reggae show, culture rock, as well as 8 hours a week of his regular eclectic output from John Peel. What I was failing to do was to get the message across to the opinion formers, one in particular, our new Deputy Director-General, John Burt. John was there at one of the regular Board of Governors meetings when I had my turn to address them all on Radio 1 The Way Ahead, and I took that opportunity to bang on once again about our lack of an FM network. I said loud and clear that I saw it as part of my job to trawl young listeners into the BBC net, so that over the years they may become aware of the range of programmes the BBC has to offer. Finally, I told them that I'd like to broadcast for 24 hours a day, as it was a nonsense that the youth network should shut down at a time when most of the audience were awake. Following discussions with our managing director and the director of programs, I had written a discussion note to my team on the subject of what sort of network does the BBC expect Radio 1 to be. If we were to make Radio 1 an all-day youth network aimed primarily at 16 to 25s, then it was clear the audience would fall because demographically by 1996 there would be 1.4 million less of that age group. There would be a further erosion caused by the alienation of the older listeners if we changed the music policy. If the audience fell too far, I wondered what the board's reaction would be, having spent several £1 million equipping us with a new FM stereo network. Not happy, I'd guess. We were in a quandary with no clear brief from above on which way to go. In the meantime, all I could do was to continue with the policy of trying to please as many listeners as possible most of the time. A single music channel could no longer satisfy everyone, and I needed some guidance on who we were supposed to be serving. It was in 1987 that I decided to get rid of Jimmy Savile, so perhaps now is the time for me to write my perspective on him and his role in Radio 1 and the BBC in general. Chapter 16, The BBC and the Savile Problem. Jimmy Savile was probably one of the greatest con artists of all time. What do they say? You can fool some of the people some of the time. But here was a man who fooled not just me, but nearly everyone he worked with all of the time. To set the scene, I have to try to explain what office life was like back in the swinging 60s. If you've seen the TV series Mad Men, or Dolly Parton's new musical 9 to 5, you will get an idea. It wasn't just in the BBC, it was the same in most large organisations. Women's lib had not been heard of. In the office place, men were firmly in charge, and women were there in a much more subservient role, working as secretaries and making the tea. If anything, the BBC was ahead of the game in recognising that women had more to offer. There were a few women in senior positions in the BBC, but not that many. There were lots of boys and girls working in Radio 1. It was the heart of the pop business, and it was fun. It was like a happy family, a very free and easy place to work. Mild flirtations were the order of the day, and the girls gave as good as they got. No one talked about sexual harassment. It was against this background in 1968, a year after it started, that Jimmy Savile finally joined Britain's favourite radio station. Jimmy had never wanted to be just another DJ on the station, and was canny enough to wait for a year to see how it was going before he joined. He was also shrewd enough to realise that there was more mileage in joining as a solo turn than at the same time as all the others. His first programme had a very different format from most DJ shows. It was called Savile's Travels. The format was very simple. Jimmy was always out and about on some project or other, so he took a portable tape machine with him and recorded anything which might be of interest en route. So, by the very definition of the title, Savile's Travels, Jim was not in the Radio 1 building for very much time. The producer collected the tapes, edited the most interesting selections, slotted some records in between, and there you had it, an hour a week with no problems. After a while, Jimmy found more demanding work on Radio 1. The then-controller, Douglas Muggeridge, thought it would be a good idea if we did a little more public service amongst all this pop stuff. And it was he that scheduled Speakeasy, a 45-minute programme produced by the Reverend Roy Trevivian. Roy, who worked in the BBC's religious department, was an eccentric character with a good reputation as a populist producer. This became Radio 1's first talk show. Roy was responsible for the speech elements, and producer Jeff Griffin from Radio 1 looked after the live music. It was an early example of a joint production. Typically, management imagined that if they gave the programme a pop signature tune, Yakety Yak by the Coasters, and a pop DJ like Savile, it wouldn't cause too many people to switch off. The show had a studio audience. They were people who'd applied to the BBC ticket unit, and each week several interesting guests were booked to debate such topics as teenage marriage, nudity, soft drugs, the controversial record Je T'aime, the effect of alcoholic drinks, and so on. Despite the misconceptions held by we pop music staff, Jimmy's populist approach made that talk show work. In all his time at Radio 1, I never worked as Jimmy's producer, and by the time I took over as controller, he was only doing one show a week, and that was an oldies show on Sundays. Frankly, I thought it was old hat for the style of Radio 1 I was trying to develop, so I was the one that got rid of him from Radio 1 in 1987. But I suppose I should have expected the sacking would cause me problems. I called Jimmy in for a meeting. These situations are never easy, and Jimmy had been broadcasting for a long time. It went very well. We had an amicable discussion about it, and I knew if word got out to the press they would have a field day, so it was important to keep it confidential until I had secured a replacement for Jim. At the same time that this was going on, we were running another social action campaign, Action Special, about youth employment, and I was about to hire a new presenter, Nicky Campbell. Jimmy, shrewd as ever, suggested that when the time came to announce his departure, we should use the opportunity to say he was moving over to make a vacancy for a younger DJ, in line with our own Jobs for Youth campaign. Very good. The meeting ended on a satisfactory note. We shook hands, and I went off to Cardiff, where my son David was being awarded his degree. On the way back from Wales, I turned on the mobile phone. It rang immediately. Dave Price, my chief assistant, was on and very agitated. "Thank goodness you've got the phone on. The phones are going crazy here. The Sun has got hold of the Jimmy Savile story and it's going to be all over the paper tomorrow. I know nothing about it, so can you please get together with the press office and put out some sort of response?" Well, to this day I don't know how the Sun got hold of it, but I always suspected that the devious Jim had spilled the beans in order to turn it into a story in his favour, with himself as a sacked victim. And I tell this story to show what a complex personality Jimmy had. Yet through all his time at Radio 1, none of us in management had a clue about the sexual activities he was up to. There was no evidence of any impropriety reaching me, although there were a few rumours about his attraction to young members of the opposite sex. Personally, I always thought he was rather asexual, without any real interest in boys or girls. How wrong can you be? In fact, I only found out when the paedophile story broke that back in the 1970s, the then controller Douglas Muggeridge had heard the rumours about Jimmy and had asked my boss Derek Chinnery to see him and find out if there was any truth in these stories. Jimmy, of course, denied everything, and Derek, like many others, was convinced by Jimmy there was nothing to be uncovered. Despite all the furore that has now developed, it wasn't just we BBC staff who were fooled, so were those at Broadmoor, Leeds Infirmary, Stoke Mandeville, and wherever else in the National Health Service he worked, not to mention Mrs. Thatcher, Tony Blair, and the Prince and Princess of Wales. It was amazing that no detail of any actual indiscretions ever came the way of the Radio 1 management in the 1980s. Practically there wasn't much opportunity in Radio 1's building anyway. The offices were like rabbit hutches, and it was a very overcrowded environment with strict security on the front door, so I doubt very much that Savile could have brought in any young girls, or boys for that matter. Jimmy was something of an enigma. In all the time I ever knew him, he never stopped being Jimmy Savile. I always thought there was a different Jimmy underneath the part he played, but no matter how hard I looked, I never found it. I think the closest anyone got was the television presenter Louis Theroux, who made one of his specials where he followed Jimmy around with the television crew for a couple of weeks. In October 2011, my wife and I went to his funeral in Leeds. Well, you would have thought it was a royal occasion. People queued up at the Queen's Hotel, where Jimmy was lying in state for 3 days, and then they lined the streets as the funeral cortege went past. The whole of Yorkshire was certainly fooled, which explains why people were so angry when the truth came out last October. He was certainly very intelligent. He was a member of Mensa, and clearly used his intelligence to cover his sexual activity under the cloak of doing a tremendous amount for charity at St James Infirmary in Leeds, Stoke Mandeville and Broadmoor. Years earlier, before I was controller, we were on his home patch of Leeds, where he made a personal appearance as a guest on the Radio 1 Roadshow in Roundhay Park. After the show, he invited my wife and I up to his flat for tea. At last I thought a chance to see the real Jim off-duty at home. We took a lift up to the penthouse flat overlooking the park. For all I knew, Jimmy owned the whole block, but we went into a quite ordinary non-luxurious apartment where Jimmy was at home. Not to any teenage girls, but to a bunch of old men who were ex-miners with whom he'd worked as a youth. Introductions were made to one and all, and we had a nice cup of tea out of mugs, while Jimmy carried on being the public personality as usual. He never stopped being Jimmy Savile. As I said, he fooled us all, including prime ministers and royalty, and I doubt that anyone will really know the whole truth. With its 2 independent inquiries, the BBC is trying to establish what went on. It's my view, though, that the press is being somewhat hypocritical in fanning the flames with hysterical reporting, when they themselves could have been just as active in exposing the man. Wasn't it a perfect story for the news of the world? Did not the atmosphere of sexual harassment pervade Fleet Street and other television and radio companies? I'm not saying the BBC is innocent, but the majority of people working there are decent, honourable folk with children of their own, and I'm sure they were just as shocked as anyone at what is being uncovered. If they had any inkling or proof of what was going on, I'm sure they would have exposed this evil man. His original tombstone was engraved with the words, "It was good while it lasted." Maybe it should have said, "Glad they never found me out." Chapter 17. Mrs. Thatcher and another newspaper row. As the general election approached, we agreed to do a Radio 1 phone-in with Margaret Thatcher. Before her arrival, the special branch, complete with sniffer dogs, came to check that the building was secure. It was somewhat disturbing for the female staff when they went to use the ladies' toilet to be told by a lady police officer, "You can't go in there, it's been sniffed." The actual broadcast, though, was an interesting experience. Margaret arrived, accompanied by a couple of aides from Conservative Central Office, and was surprisingly nervous. Simon Bates was the front man for the hour-long show. When the programme was over, I asked her if she'd care for a drink with us. "Well, really, I should be getting back to Dennis," she said, sounding more like a worried housewife than an experienced politician. "But perhaps I'll just have a small whisky." As I went to pour it, she spotted on the drinks trolley a couple of bottles of French Perrier water. "Why are you serving that French muck when there's perfectly good British water? The BBC should know better." Not a good way to start what I perceived as a little relaxing conversation. She then went on to talk non-stop about herself and the campaign and where she was heading next, Windsor being one of those places. I mentioned that we too were going to Windsor with royalty for our roadshow coverage of the forthcoming It's a Royal Knockout, but Margaret wasn't interested. By then she'd moved on to lecture us about the meaning of friendship, and how supporting President Reagan over the bombing of Libya and allowing his planes to use RAF airfields, that's what true friendship was all about. And for once even Simon Bates was lost for words, and there wasn't a lot to say after that. The lady finished her whisky and swept out, followed by her 2 aides in search of Dennis, for whom I guess she was going to prepare supper. Shepherd's pie? Well, I don't know, but she did win the election. By now, John Peel had been with Radio 1 for 20 years. To celebrate his association with the network, I commissioned John and his producer John Waters to make a 6-hour documentary, Peeling Back the Years, an autobiographical account of John's life in music. I think we all recognise that John was more than just a man with a good ear for music. While in Japan earlier, he'd made a Sony Award-winning documentary on the World Popular Song Festival, so it was logical to encourage his talents for quirky investigation. We sent him to Belgium to make one on the Eurovision Song Contest, and also a series of 4 one-hour programmes, Rebel Yell, which explored the history of anti-establishment music and the impact it had made over the years. As part of the 20th birthday celebrations, we were interested to see how the music had changed over 20 years. I asked Gallup, who prepared the charts, to compile a 20th birthday chart of the 100 best-selling singles and albums over the period. Listeners could write in for a copy and we mailed out thousands. The top single was Do They Know It's Christmas by Band Aid, with ABBA's Fernando at number 100, while the top album was Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits. After 20 years of sharing scraps of Radio 2's airtime, at last we opened our first FM transmitter in the south of England, so we were broadcasting continually in high quality. It was a huge morale booster to all of us, and we put on a special promotional event in Waterloo Station to draw attention to it. Around this time I had a huge row with Janice Long, which sadly became public knowledge. When she was first confirmed as being pregnant, it was while she was presenting the Radio 1 Roadshow in the North East. Janice had been doing a good job presenting the mid-evening slot on the network and asked for maternity leave in February to have this first child. Having had 2 children of my own, I knew only too well the difficulties of coping with a new baby, the lack of sleep, and trying to do a regular evening show, So I proposed to her that until she was over these first few months following the birth, she should do only one night a week on Saturdays. We parted, and I was under the impression she'd accepted what I said. To this day I don't know what changed her mind. Was it the prospective drop in income? Was it her partner, her agent? Or did she just think about it before deciding I was a misogynist bastard? The next thing I knew was that there were headlines in the tabloids. "Sacked the DJ who dared to have a baby." The gist of the articles was that I was engaged in some sort of moral crusade and had cut her airtime as a punishment for being an unmarried mum. If she'd done her research, she would have discovered I already employed a broadcaster who was an unmarried mum, and my record on the broadcasting of sexual matters was more liberal than any other controller in the BBC. I was so upset that my caring offer had been thrown back in my face that I withdrew the Saturday night offer too. There was another DJ problem over and above that one concerning Janice Long. Mike Smith, who'd been doing a super job on The Breakfast Show, came to see me because he wanted to come off it. I was not best pleased at this news that he'd only been in the job for 2 years. He was doing very good business, and I'd hoped for at least a 4 or 5 year run with Mike in the chair, because I knew if we got The Breakfast Show right, the remainder of the day fell into place behind it. Mike, though, had been burning the candle at both ends, as he was very much in demand in BBC television, and in the long run this is where he saw his future. I was sorry to let him go. I made some discreet overtures to Chris Tarrant to see if he would like to come to replace Mike, but we couldn't afford him. So we took the opportunity to promote another up-and-coming talent, Simon Mayo. University educated, Simon epitomised the new breed of DJ I was looking for. He was going to bring a more intelligent approach with less emphasis on personality. We rejigged the show and launched it in May 1988, using the American Zoo format. This revolved around Simon as Master of Ceremonies, with Rob Mackenzie dropping in news headlines every 20 minutes, and with Carol Dooley as the weather girl. Carol didn't stay long, though. She had an offer from TVAM and was replaced by Sybil Roscoe. Simon Mayo was a bigger success than I ever dreamed he would be. Before long, our audience research showed Radio 1 as having 20 million listeners a week. In fact, so successful was Simon that he went on to be the second longest breakfast DJ on the network, being only surpassed by Tony Blackburn. Looking back now, I seem to have been plagued by DJ problems in 1988. Next one to really upset me was Johnny Walker. I'd stuck my neck out for him to bring him back 18 months earlier on the stereo sequence, and he'd been doing a great job on it. But skullduggery was at work from an unlikely source, Richard Branson's Virgin Radio. They had made an approach to Johnny to come and work for them on a new radio service to be distributed by satellite, Radio. What annoyed me most was that Johnny's manager was someone I thought of as a friend, Harry Barter. Without giving me the opportunity to match their offer financially, Harry had concluded and signed a deal with Virgin. I'll admit to a certain amount of satisfaction when this satellite venture failed and Johnny was reduced to taking a job on the BBC local radio, GLR. Johnny's departure turned out to be a bonus for us because I heard on the grapevine that Roger Scott, one of Capital Radio's really big stars for the first 15 years, was very unhappy with their current musical approach. We met through a mutual friend, Phil Swern. We talked and Roger liked what I was saying about the range of music I expected from him, and as a result, on July the 2nd, he took over as the DJ on the stereo sequence. It was to be the start of a friendship and professional relationship which lasted until he died. In fact, Roger asked me if he could have Phil Swern as his producer on the Sunday night show. I was delighted to arrange it and appointed Phil on a short-term contract as Roger's producer. Phil was also producing Round Table with Mike Reed as the regular host. This was the show where a couple of star guests sat in the studio discussing the week's new record releases. Mostly it was an amiable little programme, but some of the guests got the wrong idea about what was expected of them. When Phil was producing it, he and Mike had a terrible time when David Coverdale of White Snake was booked for the job. He arrived in a bad mood, and the first question to Phil was, "Where's the fucking drink?" Phil very politely pointed out that there was tea and coffee, and an alcoholic drink would be available after the show. This wasn't to Mr. Coverdale's liking, and when the programme started, he sat sulking at the back of the studio, well away from the mic, and shouted his comments. While record number 2 was playing, Phil asked him to join in properly and sit at the table where the microphone was sited. Again he refused. It sounded terrible. Phil gave him one more chance during record number 3, but still there was no cooperation, so for the first time in his career, Phil had to ask security to throw out his guest. Billy Idol was another one who behaved in much the same way, but he was incapable of giving any sensible reviews because he was out of his head on something pretty toxic. I was in the wars with another paper, the Daily Mail, in August, with MPs calling for my sacking. Radio 1 in sex storm was the headline, after I announced a series of feature programmes to be introduced by John Peel called What's Love Got to Do With It? In line with all our social action programmes, these were non-judgmental stories telling the practical details of sexual intercourse told by young people for young people. As you can imagine, the Daily Mail, no lover of the BBC, was out for blood, preferably mine. They contacted a few right-wing MPs who were always good for a quote, regardless of whether they'd heard the programme or not. Winston Churchill said, "It's highly objectionable for such material to be broadcast, and doubly objectionable that it should come from the BBC. Mr. Beerling should be sacked." Mary Whitehouse, too, had her way. "This is just cheap exploitation, public sex. Broadcasting this subject to millions of young people does more harm than good." I knew the programmes were right for the audience for which they were aimed, and they went out without any complaints from our listeners. Probably the publicity helped attract a few more listeners, though I doubted many of them were Daily Mail readers. As a spin-off from my support for sex education programmes, Chris Longley, the executive in charge of the production unit, started an internal campaign to get condoms called controllers after me. She had experienced production problems over language when speaking explicitly about sexual activities, so she wanted to try to develop new words. For condoms, she figured Johnnies weren't good enough, though I never knew why. Anyway, controllers never caught on, so I lost my entry in the Oxford English Dictionary. In order to broaden the scope of Radio 1 more, I asked my friend Martin Fisher, who ran the light entertainment department, if his team could come up with a contemporary comedy with a specific appeal for young people. The first of these was Hey Radio, featuring some of the better young stand-up comedians. This proved popular enough to warrant further commissions, and comedy became a regular feature of Radio 1 during my time, the most memorable series being The Mary Whitehouse Experience, which later transferred to television. The funniest were those put together by Victor Lewis Smith and Lenny Henry. In 1988 we celebrated 21 years of Radio 1 broadcasting. It had crept up so fast, so much had happened, and so much had been achieved. The on-air time was longer, the range of programmes was bigger than ever, the breadth of music wider, and we had more news and social action. All of this was being broadcast on a stereo FM network that ensured most of our audience could hear it. What else did we need to do to maintain our profile? Chapter 18. Around the World and a Tragic Loss. One of the most bizarre events I was ever involved with was the live broadcast of Jean-Michel Jarre's Sony Lumière concert from Docklands. Mel Bush had taken over the promotion of the show when it was clear it was going to be in difficulties unless a lot more seats were sold. He proposed that Radio 1 should be the official sponsor of the concert, with the right to broadcast it live on our new stereo FM transmitter covering southern England. It was fairly avant-garde and it looked like fun. All the light displays in the show were projected onto the Tate and Lyle building in Docklands, while the sounds were relayed via giant speaker stacks to a large audience seated in grandstands. I thought this would make a great opportunity to improve our profile with the Board of Management, and personally invited all the top people and their wives or partners. To start the evening I had organised a special river bus to pick up all the guests at Westminster Pier. We had secretaries to escort them and present each guest with a special target tuner. That's a radio pre-tuned to the local FM stereo transmitter. Through their headsets they could watch the spectacle and enjoy our broadcast coverage. It sounded idyllic on paper, and at 6 o'clock we welcomed Michael Checkland, the Director-General, his deputy, John Burt, the Director of Finance, Ian Phillips, the Managing Director of Radio, David Hatch, his Director of Resources, Duncan Thomas, and the Controller of Radio 2, Bryant Marriott, and they all brought their other halves. I had arranged with Mel Bush and Polydor Records that there would be a splendid reception after the show for the participating artists and the important guests, including all my party. However, we didn't take into account the British weather. It was as bad as it could be, with a howling gale blowing up the river and driving rain in a temperature well below average. My greeting girls had anticipated the chill and obtained a few dozen miniatures of brandy, which they quickly branded with Radio 1 fluffy bugs. These were distributed among the visitors as they steamed upriver. Things were no better on arrival, as the grandstands were not covered, and the best seats were higher and therefore more exposed. To this day I will treasure the memory as Michael Checklin, the Director-General, sat in the stand peering through the murk across the Thames, with a neck scarf pulled over his head. He looked like some elderly pensioner as he enjoyed the show. I suppose the brandy helped, because to their credit everyone stayed, and once we got to the party afterwards they thawed out. Undoubtedly it was one of my more memorable moments, and the next time I invited VIPs I made sure the weather couldn't interfere with the event. In 1989 I was pleased to welcome back an old friend, Alan Fluff Freeman. Mike Reid had taken over the oldies show from Jimmy Savile when I first came in, but in audience terms this had proved to be a big mistake. An examination of the figures in early '88 showed Mike Reid to have lost over 1 million listeners to each programme, giving us a large dent in the Sunday profile. Something had to be done. Mike's producer, Roger Pusey, argued strongly for more time, and tinkered with the content and format, but to little effect, and after a year I sounded out Fluff, who was working at Capitol, where he'd just won an award. He was flattered that at 61 I would want him back on national radio. I knew his real musical interest was rock music, so I offered him a package, his own Saturday night classic rock show, and a revised version of Pick of the Pops on Sunday afternoons. This started on January the 14th. The press officer, Jeff Simpson, decided that as Fluff was so old there was no point in hiding it, so he devised a photo call on a double-decker bus, with Fluff waving his bus pass. While Fluff was one of the oldest, if not the oldest at the time, another recruit from Capitol became our youngest DJ. She was Jackie Brambles, aged 22. Contrary to what many people think, I was keen to see a more representative cross-section of on-air voices. On the female side we already had Rankin Miss P, Ro Newton, Sybil Roscoe, Anne Nightingale, Liz Kershaw, and of course I had employed Janice Long before the bust-up. It was good to add someone young and enthusiastic like Jackie. Initially she started on the early show, but later she made it to midday, until she went off to America with her husband. By this time, early 1989, Simon Bates was working with one of the most imaginative producers in Radio 1, Jonathan Ruffell. John was great fun, a very practical man, full of creative ideas, and provided the perfect complement to Simon's enthusiasm and ebullience. Between them they dreamed up one of the biggest proposals in the lifetime of Radio 1, and certainly one of the biggest things we ever attempted. Remember, this was ages before Michael Palin started his TV travels. Simon and Jonathan were proposing an attempt by the pair of them, unsupported, to circumnavigate the world using only land or water surface transport, while broadcasting daily for at least 30 minutes. Their tour was to coincide with the Roadshow tour, so that while that went round the coastline of the UK, in 67 days they would go around the world in the same time frame, the Round the World Challenge. To give it even more credibility, they proposed to do it in association with Oxfam to raise £1 million and awareness of that organisation. They loved to be mysterious and to keep everyone guessing, so much of the detail was glossed over when they took me to lunch one day to outline the project. But what did I think? If they could pull it off, I agreed it would be fantastic from every point of view. It would make good radio, I had no doubt about their ability to deliver, if they could overcome the technical difficulties, and it would be very good for Oxfam, and as for publicity for Radio 1, the opportunities were enormous. We set up a production team in London, Chris Lysett in charge, with producer Fergus Dudley and studio manager Brian Thompson to handle the incoming material. When it came near to the start date, they actually left 4 days early, as Jonathan came to me and said, "Johnny, there's a container ship leaving from Barry Island on Friday for the West Indies, and we need to be on it." I agreed they could go before the Roadshow tour started, but it was within the principle because that too set off for Northern Ireland on the same day. We organised a huge public send-off for Jonathan and Simon in front of Broadcasting House on June the 30th. It was a pretty impressive sight because they were staggering under the most enormous load of equipment, which included their so-called lightweight satellite uplink dish. This piece of kit, together with a portable generator, weighed around 90 kilos without their personal luggage. They needed to be fit, and I was pleased to hear they had been undergoing some personal fitness training before they set off. The difficulty of sustaining the interest in the broadcast was a potential problem. When you're on a container ship for 10 days, what else can you do after you've talked to various members of the crew and described the sea? They solved this with the help from Fergus Dudley in London. He set up an assortment of star interviews. Thus we had Liza Minnelli sitting in Egton House in London, being interviewed by Simon Bates on a ship thousands of miles away. As she said afterwards, that was one of the most bizarre interviews of my life. The project caught the imagination of the listeners, not just through the radio broadcast, but also through the TV reports they made on children's television. There was a programme called Up to You. To maintain listener interest in the story, we ran an on-air competition for a listener to go and meet them at the halfway point in Tokyo. I took the winner, Joanne Holton from Staffordshire. I won't forget the scene as Joanne and I went to the docks in Tokyo where Simon and Jonathan had just arrived, having bummed a lift on board one of those enormous container ships. Simon came rushing down the gangplank to greet us with open arms, while poor old Jonathan staggered after him, weighed down by the 90 kilos of dish. A fair distribution of labour, Simon would say. Joking apart, they did very well. They made some super radio shows, and I was very sorry for them when they came unstuck on their way back. This was because Saudi Arabia refused them permission to cross overland and insisted that they overfly that country. Nevertheless, in their 78 days away, they covered 25,000 miles through 27 countries on ships, trains, camels, cars, buses, donkeys and trucks, and they raised £300,000 for Oxfam's Third World projects. They were pretty shattered when they arrived back to a hero's welcome. Smiley Miley and another producer, Mick Wilcoich, had decorated the front of Broadcasting House with Welcome Home banners, something which had never been done in the history of the BBC. The Roadshow vehicle was parked outside, and several hundred fans gathered to greet them. It was one of the outstanding events staged during my time at Radio 1, and I was very grateful they'd brought it to me. It's always sad when someone dies, but I was particularly upset when Roger Scott went. He hadn't been with us all that long and had made a terrific impact with the national audience, where he earned respect for his musical integrity and his championing of good adult rock presented with no frills. In September 1989, when we knew the end for Roger was inevitable, Phil Swern and I decided to take a holiday on the Costa del Sol. We asked Roger to come down to join us for what would be his last holiday. He flew into Gibraltar and we picked him up looking very pale and thin. We drove to our temporary home where we gave him as good a time as we could while lazing on the veranda, taking in the sun, enjoying a few drinks and what food he could manage to take. Inevitably, throughout the visit we chatted about his life and his interest in music. Roger was such a professional that he realised the archive value of getting all of this recorded, and he asked me to tape our conversations. He even supplied me with rare personal archive tapes of his early career, and all this became the basis of a 2-hour documentary which I put together as a broadcast tribute to him after he died. He realised too that there would be a huge press interest in this very difficult time, so he decided to turn it into a positive and grant an interview in the press in return for a donation to cancer charities. The highest fee was offered by the News of the World, and Roger told his story to a journalist he knew, Leslie Ann Jones, and she wrote it up in a very sensitive way. At the bottom of the article was a line that Roger's fee of £30,000 for the article would be donated to cancer charities. He managed to keep broadcasting until 2 weeks before his death on October the 31st, a couple of weeks after he'd celebrated his 46th birthday. If anyone died too soon, it was Roger. In December there was a huge memorial ceremony at EMI's Abbey Road Studio 1 where hundreds of friends and performers turned up to pay tribute to Roger. Cliff Richard, Dave Edmonds and Nick Lowe, Chris Rea, Mark Knopfler and Guy Fletcher all played live, while Paul Gambaccini, Phil Swern, Jan Ravens, Chris Mason and Tim Blackmore all spoke in tribute to Roger's contribution to music. The most poignant moment of all was the live performance of a song called Rex Bob Lowenstein by the man who wrote it, Mark Giamino. He came over from America specially, and if you know the song, you'll know it tells the story of a DJ who wouldn't compromise his musical taste to meet commercial pressures, and that description fitted Roger Scott to a T. As he said, "All I ever wanted to do was get behind the microphone and share with the listeners this great piece of music I just found." Rest in peace, Roger. With Roger Scott's death, there arose an opportunity for the former presenter of the old grey whistle test, Bob Harris, to take over, and we couldn't have picked a nicer man. Bob loves his music and was as much an enthusiast as Roger, and I'm pleased to say that at the time of recording this, Bob is still entertaining, though he's now on Radio 2. As a demonstration of the broadening range of our output, I booked the enfant terrible of Radio 4's Loose Ends, Victor Lewis Smith, with his partner Paul Sparks, to do an independent series. It was quite brilliant, but there was hardly a single BBC rule which Victor didn't seek to break in delivering new and challenging comedy. He would always deliver his finished programme at the last possible moment, so there was little chance for the poor Radio 1 producer responsible for it to do much editing. Victor relied on the pompous stupidity of some people to gain a laugh. On one occasion he rang Harrods, and as a very camp customer complained that he and his boyfriend couldn't get any satisfaction from a Hoover which they had bought, and which didn't have enough sucking power to do the job for which they were using it. There were many more such items which we thought very funny, but which pushed the boundaries of radio comedy further than they had ever been pushed before. Victor and I had many rows over the content, but it was a good series, and it won an award for the best radio comedy at the British Comedy Awards a year later. Victor had the last laugh because he issued a CD of the shows, which contained many of the strongest sketches which I had made him edit before transmission. Another of our ambitions at this time was to set up a permanent free Radio 1 telephone helpline. Until 1990 we had run these phone services with the support of various agencies while a specific campaign was being broadcast. During Action Special for Jobs we had answered 10,000 calls in a week, so it was clear there was a demand for a permanent service to which our listeners could turn for help and advice on anything. Eventually the BBC found the funds, which led to the setting up of the free helpline. This came about because John Burt had implemented a round of BBC-wide cuts, and it was pointed out that the Radio Directorate hadn't benefited from any of the actual cash. So he agreed to put some of the savings towards the helpline. Once again we started something which nowadays operates across the whole BBC. How often do you hear, "If you want advice on so-and-so and so-and-so, call the BBC Action line on da-da-da-da-da." Just remember, all that started with Radio 1. During the summer of 1990 we broadcast a very large number of live concerts. Eric Clapton, Phil Collins, David Bowie, Fleetwood Mac, Eurasia, Tina Turner, and the infamous one by Madonna at Wembley Stadium, where she managed to set an all-time record for the broadcasting of the word fuck 31 times in 2 minutes. We had promised to broadcast more live concerts, and this was the price. But I have to say there weren't that many complaints in the BBC duty log. Perhaps our listeners were not as sensitive as the watchdogs. Soon after this I had to go to Turkey with my boss David Hatch for a European Broadcasting Union meeting. One afternoon David suggested we give the conference a miss and go for a little cruise along the shore. The purpose of this became clear as the afternoon progressed. "How much longer do you think you should go on as controller of Radio 1? Asked David. "You've made a splendid contribution, and you know what I think of your work, but you've been at it now since Radio 1 started, and I'm inclined to think it's time to let you off the hook." This was typical of David's approach, not the sack, but a gentle offer of a way out. I wasn't all that surprised or uninterested. It had, after all, been a very long time since I started the first Radio 1 programme with Tony Blackburn. By the end of the afternoon we had agreed an outline plan and a timetable for my eventual departure sometime next year. In the meantime, mum's the word, and we went back to shore and resumed our places at the EBU conference. Alas, the best-laid plans of David Hatch and Johnny Beerling were not to come to fruition, that for reasons which will become clear very soon. Chapter 19. The End in Sight for Me. In the early 90s we were doing pretty well in Radio 1, but another problem was looming. The average age of our audience was around 29, and DJs like Bob Harris, Simon Bates, Dave Lee Travis and Alan Freeman were all older than that. As part of the charter review process, there had been yet another BBC task force looking at the total output of the BBC. This discrepancy between the age of the presenters and the audience had emerged as a result of the task force inquiries. Inevitably, some unscrupulous person had leaked it to the tabloids, and in August all kinds of scaremongering headlines ensued, which suggested I was about to sack all the oldies. More reassurance was needed all round. Dave Lee Travis was very touchy about all this. It had been clear to all of us, including Dave himself, that he was less and less in sympathy with my mission to broaden the music policy. While he was a very good DJ, more than any other presenter, he continually showed he was out of touch with the direction in which Radio 1 was going. He talked too much, especially about himself, his farm and his animals, and wasn't all that sympathetic to new music, preferring his classic oldies. This led to numerous rows with his producer and management. His frustration spilled over one day, and without a word to anyone he went off to seek an audience with John Burt. To my surprise, John agreed to see him and listen to his tale of woe, but was uncompromising in setting his objectives for Radio 1. John suggested that Dave went to see Francis Lyne, the controller of Radio 2, where his musical interests might be better appreciated. Sadly for Dave, Francis told him that she had no room for him either, which I thought was a pity because I believe he would have been an asset to her. From that moment on it was inevitable that Dave's days were numbered. The only surprise was how much longer he soldiered on, fighting the system. In March 1992 we set a new spring schedule in preparation for the future. We knew that a national commercial network, Independent Network Radio 2, would be launching. We didn't know it was going to go to Virgin Radio, though we feared it would broadcast a mixture of pop and sport. We analysed our strengths and weaknesses and made some consequent changes. Mark Story, one of my producers, knew that Independent Local Radio had its annual audience research sweep in the spring. So it was Mark's notion to run a major network promotional competition for the whole of May. And in it, Radio 1 listeners could win prizes that money couldn't buy. It had to be this way because there was no way we could match the cash prizes commercial radio was offering. In other words, there would be unique opportunities for listeners, and we would use the circumstances of their win to make even more interesting broadcasting reports. I thought it worth a try too to put on the revolutionary Chris Evans from BBC GLR on Sunday afternoons. The programme was called Too Much Gravy. Of that experiment I can only say he was more trouble than he was worth. The show was good, there was no doubt about that, but at GLR he and his collection of buddies had been allowed to produce themselves and do more or less as they liked. On network radio things were different. We couldn't have anarchy, and we'd given him Lucy Armitage as his producer. It wasn't her role to stifle his creativity, but she did have to be firm on some matters. Chris was a rebel who didn't take kindly to the notion of being told what to do by a producer. We lost count of the number of times she was reduced to tears by Chris's response to suggestions made by her. So, after 6 months, it was goodbye to Chris Evans, until Matthew Bannister took over. I was somewhat surprised and flattered in March to be presented with an award by the Radio Academy for an outstanding contribution to music radio. Before the award was given, the Academy members were entertained by a very amusing short film put together by a man called Andy Hudson, and he called it Who is Johnny Beerling? It was introduced by Alan Fluff Freeman, with appearances by Sir Michael Checklin, then the Director-General, Chris Wright, the Chairman of Chrysalis, my hairdresser for years, Dave Harvey, Smiley Miley and Doreen Davis. Andy had also woven in many clips of events in my Radio 1 life. I was specially thrilled to be given it, as I was the first non-broadcaster to receive it. I thought, maybe I should quit while I was ahead. Chapter 20, John Burt and Our Big Birthday. Before you started reading this book, you might have thought that running a great entertainment station like Radio 1 was nothing but a bundle of laughs. As you now know, it wasn't always pleasurable running the wireless within the BBC. It required a great deal of serious, hard work. Whatever the changes I had introduced, I knew we were still going to be under threat for not being distinctive or different enough. Word had reached me that John Burt had listened to Radio 1 and couldn't hear any difference between us and Capital Radio. He certainly knew how to hurt a man, and I suspected John was a man with a hearing problem. I played their game by commissioning my own report on the network's output from Dr. David Morrison. He was Research Director at the Institute of Communication Studies at Leeds University. This more or less confirmed our value to society as a provider of popular culture. David had surveyed over 100 people, members of the public as well as industry figures, and more than half of those questioned thought Radio 1 did more than any other station to promote new acts and offer live music and interviews, while 3/4 said the station had introduced them to new music. Jeff Simpson, our very loyal press officer, did his stuff by planting a series of stories about this report and our commitment to live music. To show it, I held a press launch to announce our summer concert coverage. Executive producer Stuart Grundy and producers Jeff Griffin and Tony Wilson had pulled out all the stops to obtain broadcasts of some really big ones. Elton John live from Barcelona, Genesis live from Nebworth, a Freddie Mercury tribute concert, a Bryan Adams concert, a Giants of Motown concert, Bruce Springsteen live from LA, Dire Straits from Woburn Abbey, Wet 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 from the Isle of Arran, the Monsters of Rock from Donington, Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells 2 from Edinburgh Castle, and in addition to all these, Michael Jackson agreed to a live broadcast of his show from the National Stadium in Bucharest, Romania, for our birthday. Carhilo Doherty, our promotions boss, set up an advertising campaign to support it. The summer's best live concerts, only on 1FM. And another slogan, if you can't turn up, tune in. My thinking was that many listeners couldn't afford tickets, so as part of our public service, we should offer them a chance to hear the best artists via our airwaves. There was some light relief from BBC Politics. One of our producers, Roger Pusey, had established a good relationship with the Red Arrows aerobatic team. On several occasions the team had put on their spectacular displays in the West Country to coincide with visits by the Radio 1 Roadshow, and Roger arranged for us to visit them at their home base, RAF Scampton, in Lincolnshire. Chatting to the pilots in the mess, I raised the subject of our forthcoming 25th birthday on September the 30th, and I wondered what their movements would be around that time. As it happened, they had to move the planes from Odium in southern England to RAF Lucas in Scotland. I had an idea. Could you make that flight flying in a formation of a figure 1, I asked, using the whiteboard to show them what I had in mind. Yes, that would be no problem, Johnny. Next question. If I could organise the radio links, would it be possible to put Noel Edmonds in the second seat of the lead aircraft and fly during the breakfast time? He could then report into Simon Mayo's breakfast show, while our listeners could look up and see the Red Arrows fly across Britain. Noel was a keen pilot anyway and jumped at the opportunity. Our engineers, being the wireless wizards they were, managed to overcome the radio communication problems. On September the 30th, the Red Arrows took off from Odium. Flying lead was squadron leader Adrian Thurley, with Noel sitting behind him. Noel did his stuff into breakfast and across the country, and the Radio 1 audience looked skywards. I went to Tower Bridge, where I had a good view as the planes swept across the London skyline, but sod's law being what it is, there was a low cloud base over much of the country, and many people were unable to see those magnificent men in their flying machines. It's 1992, and we're now 25 years old, and launched what one journalist described as an orgy of self-congratulation. I'm not sure that was fair. We had been the biggest and most popular station for 25 years. Since the launch of local commercial radio, though, our audiences had dropped from 26 million a week at our peak to a current figure of around 19 million. It was still nearly a quarter of the BBC's total radio audience, a very large number of people, so there was a lot to celebrate. Literally at the centre of things was a huge party-in-the-park concert, which we deliberately staged in the middle of England in Sutton Park, Birmingham. The show went ahead despite less than wonderful weather. It was a dull, drizzly day, and around 130,000 people turned up to be entertained by the Roadshow and Status Quo, shades of Live Aid there, Aswad, The Farm and Delamitri, as well as DJs Alan Freeman, Dave Lee Travis, Gary Davis, Mark Goodyear, Simon Bates, Man Ezek, Bob Harris and Jackie Brambles. Terry Jarvis of BBC Television made a film about the event and our history, and the Birmingham Evening Mail did us proud with a special supplement. While that was the centrepiece of the celebration and kicked off a whole month of those, there were many other programmes. Noel Edmonds came back to reminisce about Dingley Dell and Perkins Grange, as well as taking part in that Red Arrows flypast. Emperor Roscoe, too, was back on the air for a one-off show, and we put on an archived jukebox where listeners could request broadcast highlights from the previous 25 years. On the actual birthday at King's Cross, British Rail named an intercity express train the Radio 1, and Simon Bates broadcast from it live as it travelled from London to Edinburgh. It arrived 45 minutes late for the actual naming ceremony due to a careless JCB driver who cut through a nearby signalling cable. We broadcast and the Daily Mirror published the all-time top 100 records, chosen by 100,000 of our listeners and the Daily Mirror readers. Simon Bates did his usual superb job in selling it. Bohemian Rhapsody was number 1 and Sailing by Rod Stewart number 100. The whole thing was rounded off at an industry party for all the DJs and staff at the Roof Garden, Kensington. Noel Edmonds came back to compare the evening. He was very annoyed, I remember, because the PA system was poor and he found it hard to make himself heard over the buzz of excited conversation. Exasperated, he told them he wouldn't continue until all the rude people stopped talking. Many carried on talking. With hangovers to be nursed, we moved on. A big upset was the decision by Alan Fluff Freeman to give up Pick of the Pops at the end of the year. Fluff had reached 65, old enough for my bus pass, love, and now decided to hang up his pop picker's hat, but still wanted to retain his rock show. In truth, his producer Phil Swern had found him so deaf of late that he couldn't hear Phil's cues when to talk over the records, so Phil had resorted to a long stick with which he would prod Fluff when he required him to talk. This produced a peal of hysterical laughter, so really it was time to go. I couldn't argue with him, but was sorry to see another great broadcaster on his way out. It was yet another reminder that time was moving on, and we were all getting older. I wrote to my boss David Hatch about the need to think more radically about the relative roles and target audiences for Radio 1 and Radio 2. I argued that Radio 2 need to be adjusted and consequently leave Radio 1 to focus more on youth. I never did get a reply from David, and it took another 10 years for drastic changes to be made to Radio 2. David Hatch had a lot on his mind that autumn, and it was quite miserable for him and for the other members of the radio directorate. One didn't have to look hard for the reason. Some months earlier, the BBC board had announced that John Burt was to be the new Director General. As Michael Checkland's contract was valid until March the next year, he would remain in his post until March. John and Michael would have to work side by side as joint Directors General for an overlap period. Clearly Michael Checkland didn't think a lot of this idea and held the chairman, Duke Hussey, responsible. At the Royal Television Society's conference, Mike Checkland lost it during an interview and lashed out at Duke Hussey, saying he was too old and past it. But in doing so he put himself and the chairman in an impossible position. After a couple of days, when the dust had settled, it was announced that John would take over at Christmas. Darth Vader Burt would rule from the start of 1993. You may wonder what were the immediate consequences of John Burt taking over the top job. Across the corporation and in the press there was much speculation about 8,000 to 10,000 job cuts. But we were much more concerned about the closer implications for Broadcasting House radio management. We knew that John wasn't a huge fan of David Hatch and wondered about the implications for the wireless. We didn't have long to wait. On January the 11th, 1993, John sent for David Hatch. David had long been regarded as part of the old guard, a stout defender of his radio directorate, so we all thought this would be the last farewell. John, however, was more canny than that, better to use this man's talents inside the organisation and put him in a position where he could do no damage to John Birt's plans. How would he do that? By taking him away from the role of Managing Director of Radio and promoting him to a new role, Special Advisor to the Director General. At a stroke, David was removed from responsibility for hundreds of network radio staff and put in charge of a desk with only a secretary and a driver for support. David debated long and hard about whether to take the offer, but in the end he figured he could still be of use to his former colleagues in this new role, where he might be able to influence the decision-making and mitigate the worst excesses of the Bert regime. So in came a new managing director for radio, fresh from television at Channel 4, Liz Forgan. About radio, Liz knew very little, and David prevailed on me to forget the earlier agreement we had made for my early departure. Johnny, at least stay for a year or so, because Liz is going to need all the help she can get from experienced people like you, who can keep alive all the ideals we have. Under David Hatch, the radio directorate management had felt like a family. We were all pretty close and understood a common purpose, to make BBC Radio as good as we could. There were 5 channel controllers then. I was at Radio 1, Francis Lyne at Radio 2, John Drummond looked after Radio 3, Michael Green Radio 4, Pat Ewing Radio 5, with Duncan Thomas as Director of Resources, Frank McGurn as Chief Accountant in charge of the money, and Chris Story looking after the personnel. We were the top people in BBC Radio, and under David Hatch we had felt an ownership and responsibility for all of it. Things were changing, and not for the better. This was the background when Liz Forgan took over as my new boss. It had been a hell of a year, and I was tired and pretty unhappy as I saw the writing on the wall. It was obvious to me that it would only be a matter of time before I too followed David Hatch out of radio. Chapter 21. The Fun Stops Here. Liz Forgan was a very different kind of manager from David Hatch. David was very hands-on and wanted to be appraised of any major changes on the network. At times he would even ask me to convince him why I wanted to move a particular DJ to a different time slot. Liz, on the other hand, was concerned with policy and not detail. I went to her when all the fuss was building up over Dave Lee Travis and his lack of enthusiasm for the younger music on Radio 1. I explained that Dave, with his musical taste and style, was a natural for Radio 2. She was unmoved. If Francis Lyne, the then controller of Radio 2, didn't think Dave Lee Travis was right for Radio 2, then she, Liz, wasn't inclined to interfere. Under her, controllers were totally responsible for their output, and that was that. Eventually this led to DLT rebelling on air and my having to sack him. It was the failure of the inflexible system rather than that of the DJ. Dave was talented, but he was a square peg in a round hole. It was made clear to me that I must give priority to services which are unlikely to be supplied by commercially funded stations. In other words, we were to stop being so successful with popular music and concentrate on commissioning new comedy, new DJs, broadcast more news and current affairs, and more social action broadcasting. Those special advisers working for John Bert appeared to have a total lack of awareness that we were already doing so much of this in spades. Liz's view of her role was explained in a Guardian interview. My job is to look strategically at the 5 networks. I think of them as a map of Britain and the way they all fit together. There's a gap in the middle between Radio 1 and Radio 2, and different views on how it should be filled. We could make Radio 1 older, or Radio 2 younger. My emerging view is that the BBC cannot do everything. This was an interesting new viewpoint, and she seemed to be endorsing the musical gap that was opening between Radio 1 and Radio 2. The BBC had such a tight monopoly of national airways with Radios 1 and 2 that I suspect John Bert and Liz Forgan saw this as a potential political problem. Their response to calls for privatisation was to allow a gap in which the new national commercial station could compete hard. The overall BBC plan seemed to be deliberately make Radio 1 younger and Radio 2 older in order to open up a gap for Virgin Radio. Liz Forgan was even quoted as saying that Virgin Radio shouldn't be strangled at birth. She said, "There's a natural audience for Radio 1 that stops at age 25, and one for Radio 2 that comes down to 45 or 50. When I read that quote, I suppose I should have seen the writing on the wall for myself and the network as it then was. I wasn't as complacent as I appeared in respect of Radio 1's positioning. I'd been with it since it started, and I could see the audience profile was getting older along with the station. While it attracted big audiences, Radio 1 wasn't doing enough to bring in new, younger listeners to the BBC family of radio stations. I wasn't the man to change it. I was too close, and I'd been there too long, and I was nearly 55. Radio 1 was changing, and had changed a great deal in the 8 years of my controllership, but I was getting pretty fed up. Although I had an exit strategy when Liz came in, she asked me to stay on for a while until she had sorted out the future for the networks. I was happy to do this, but suggested what I would really like to do was to run Radio 2 for my last few years. I suggested that as part of Liz's strategy, she should let me run Radio 2 and take with me all the older DJs like Dave Lee Travis, Simon Bates, Gary Davis, Alan Freeman, Johnny Walker and Bob Harris. My idea was that we could change the music policy of Radio 2 during the daytime so as to attract the older Radio 1 listeners, and by using the power of the BBC's marketing machine, we could persuade most of the former Radio 1 listeners to retune to Radio 2, and then change Radio 1 to a much younger, sharper station for young people only. Liz turned me down flat. This was on the grounds that this approach would disadvantage the existing Radio 2 older listeners, many of whom were approaching death. I said these oldies could be persuaded to retune to BBC local radio, which already had a median age of over 50. But sadly, like Margaret Thatcher, Liz was not for turning. Look what happened to Margaret Thatcher. And then listen to what the later controller, Jim Moyer, did to Radio 2 10 years later. It became exactly the sort of station I'd set out in my proposal in 1993. If these changes had been introduced when Matthew Bannister took over, that large loss of BBC radio listeners need never have happened. With the producers and DJs pulling in one direction and the BBC bureaucracy trying to push us in another, it was hard to keep a balance. I walked that tightrope for the remainder of 1993. On June the 21st, the BBC put out a press statement. Johnny Beerling, the BBC's longest-serving programme controller, is giving up his position as controller of BBC Radio 1 on October the 31st, 1993. Liz Forgan said, "Johnny Beerling is a legend in the music business and in the world of radio. He's built Radio 1 into the nation's most popular station while nurturing the ideas of public service broadcasting in this most competitive area." The most surprising reaction to my announcement came from a very unexpected direction. John Burt called Joe, my secretary, and asked if he could come over and see me at 3:15. In he walked with a bottle of champagne and congratulated me on my hard work and thanked me for the good job I'd done. Needless to say, I was very touched and delighted by this most diplomatic gesture, and I thought more kindly of John for that. That press release resulted in a flood of news reports, with the funniest comment coming from Tony Blackburn, who said, "Johnny did me a massive favour. He fired me. I'll always be grateful he didn't let me overstay my welcome." With the announcement that I was on my bike, there was an amazing amount of speculation as to who would get the job. Jackie Brambles ran a quiz on her afternoon show, and among the potential candidates were Terry Venables, Doc Cotton, Smashy and Nicey, Basil Fawlty, and Jonathan King, the latter being nominated by himself. The staff were worried. There was much press speculation too regarding the identity of the new controller and in which direction he or she would take the network. The members of the selection board to choose my replacement were a BBC Governor, Director General John Burt, Director of Regional Broadcasting Mark Byford, the Managing Director of Radio Liz Forgan, and the Director of Human Resources Margaret Salmon. On July the 21st it was announced that Matthew Bannister had been given the job. The selection of Matthew didn't altogether surprise me, as I knew how close his editorial thinking was to that of John Burt, and John had insisted on being on the board. In Matthew, he knew he would have a safe pair of hands who would introduce the sort of changes John felt were needed. This was if the BBC were to retain Radio 1 after charter renewal. Matthew, though, would not take over officially until November the 1st, 1993, so while he started to make plans, I still had to handle the problems. The DLT problem was the major one for me that summer. I'd sneaked off for a few days trout fishing and then gone down with a tummy bug, so I was lying in my bed recovering when Press Officer Jeff Simpson called. "Johnny, have you been listening to DLT? Because he's resigned." "Well, I can't say I'm surprised, Jeff." "No," went on Jeff, "he's done it while on air." Talk about washing our dirty linen in public. As the first impact hit me, I felt a degree of relief, because we had been having a lot of behind-the-scene rows with DJs and staff over music policy. Dave was one of the old school. All he wanted to do was play the music he enjoyed to entertain his audience. He wasn't interested in BBC politics. He hadn't given anyone a warning of what he had in mind, and during his show he said to his producer, Christine Bohr, "This next link might be pretty important, so you might like to put a tape recorder across it." Luckily she did, and was able to play it to Jeff Simpson, our press officer, so he could hear it before he met the press, who were waiting as Dave came out of the building. Dave walked out carrying his empty coffee flask and was filmed by BBC Television and all the press reporters seeking comments. Luckily Dave didn't elaborate too much, and stuck to his notion that he was speaking out for all the others who couldn't stand what was going on at Radio 1. I saw Liz Forgan the next day, Monday, and she was furious. She wanted him out immediately, but I talked her round on the grounds that she was using a sledgehammer to crack a DLT nut. She conceded that he could work out his contract if he agreed not to make any more statements to the press in the interim. I reminded the staff there was a BBC rule that no one should use the BBC airwaves to promote his or her personal interests. Dave came in to see me that lunchtime, blustering on and on in a very loud voice. I hoped he would go away and realise the good sense of living with the offer I had agreed with Liz. Peace was restored for 2 whole days until Wednesday, August the 11th, when Dave came to see me to tell me he hadn't felt able to keep his lip buttoned any longer and had given an exclusive interview to Piers Morgan for The Sun. In the interview, Dave talked about the meetings with John Burt and Liz Forgan, his desire to be moved to a network where he could appeal to a middle-aged audience, and how he felt BBC morale was at an all-time low. Liz was even more furious than I. "Dirty little toad" was the description that she spat out, and I too felt somewhat betrayed. I told Dave he had effectively fired himself, and we would no longer have any need of his services. He accepted the situation and understood full well that I had no alternative. I suspect he knew anyway that the BBC was changing, and it would mean there would be little future for him in the new controllers Radio 1. This was only a forecast of what was to come. I was personally sorry to see him go, because Dave's a lovely man and our association went back more than 26 years. When I was a Radio 1 club producer, I frequently stayed with Dave and his mum and dad in their house in Manchester, a long time before he became a big-name DJ. To put across the message that Radio 1 was promoting younger presenters, we shuffled the time slots. We moved Nicky Campbell into Sundays and put in 26-year-old Claire Sturgis into Saturday mornings. This was the same Claire who'd been a programme assistant to Simon Bates. We'd let her cut her teeth earlier in the year on the Friday rock show, so she wasn't new to presenting and she liked new young music. The Radio 1 staff and the DJs were very jumpy around this period because there was so much uncertainty. There were numerous stories in the press about the end of the road for the old guard DJs, and no doubt there was some spin from inside the BBC which contributed to these. Simon Bates decided to leap before he was pushed and announced his departure on September the 23rd, and not long after, Whispering Bob Harris and Alan Freeman too heard that their services were no longer required. Matthew announced his new schedule at the end of September, and true to his brief, had moved nearly every remaining DJ either off or into a different time slot. The only 2 old-timers to survive the cull were John Peel and Annie Nightingale. The last one to leave under my stewardship of the network was Nicky Campbell. I was sorry to see him go. He left of his own accord because his wife at the time was quite ill and he couldn't cope with 4 nights a week and ensure that she had proper care. I also suspected he was a little fed up at not getting a daytime slot. I always felt Nicky was at his best interviewing his regular guests and resisted his ambitions to move into a daytime music show. That was because I knew he had more in him than that. His career in Radio 5 and on television has proved that to be true. And that's more or less the end of my time at BBC Radio 1, except for my farewell parties, and I reckon I had more of those than almost anyone in the BBC. On my last day, I was invited to dinner at the Talk of the Town. When I walked in, I was staggered to find not just 2 guests, but several hundred of my friends and colleagues at a special event organised as a fundraiser for my particular charity, the Nordorf Robbins Music Therapy. George Martin's Theme 1 was playing loudly as we were greeted by generous applause. To say I was staggered is the understatement of all time. I couldn't believe it. At table after table, hundreds of friends and celebrities were cheering me in. My old friend Tim Blackmore had produced the evening. Simon Bates was the compere. Chris Lysett and another friend, John Rubin, did speeches of tribute, and there were live performances from each decade of my career. The Barron Knights opened up with that wonderful bass riff line which sets up I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Mary Chapin Carpenter sang a couple of songs, and Hank Marvin of the Shadows played Wonderful Land, that to a backing track recorded by Brian Bennett. People talk of a night to remember, but this really was just such an occasion. As I left, I received literally hundreds of letters from people I'd worked with and friends made during 36 years in the BBC. Of all of them, there were 2 tributes that I very much appreciated. David Hatch, my former ND, wrote a personal letter, in his very hard-to-read handwriting, and in it he said, "Your listeners and your staff will never really appreciate all that you did. That's the sadness for a public servant. But in front of the fire late at night and in your dotage, you will know, and so will people like me." And then John Burt, in a speech to the Radio Academy, was also very kind. Our rock music industry is one of Britain's success stories. It thrives on Radio 1's patronage. All of this is due to the lively and commanding leadership of Johnny Beerling over the years, a man who has made a lasting mark of distinction in British popular radio. Chapter 22. Radio 1 Today. I left the BBC in 1993, nearly 20 years ago at the time of recording this. Some of you may remember the upheaval caused by my replacement Matthew Bannister. His job, as dictated by the then Director-General John Burt, was to radically change the image of Radio 1 back to a youth music station. In doing so, he took no cognizance of the existing audience or the need as One BBC to manage that change so that those disaffected listeners could be migrated to Radio 2. Between 8 and 10 million listeners switched away, and it took another 10 years for Radio 2 to replace Radio 1 as the nation's favourite. The BBC's loss was independent local radio, ILR's gain, and I reckon my departure and the subsequent changes of DJs had much to do with the boom in independent radio in the mid-90s. Bannister was there from 1993 for 5 years, and he certainly made the headlines which proved to everyone that Radio 1 had changed beyond recognition. Andy Parfitt replaced him as controller in 1998, and under Andy, Radio 1 managed to gain credibility as a specialist music station, and he tried hard to rebuild the audience. Not an easy task in this very competitive marketplace. Andy served and survived for 13 years, then his successor Ben Cooper took over as boss in 2011. First Andy and then Ben have been hampered by directives from the BBC Trust. In the old days when I ran it, we had a different mission: get the biggest audiences you can. The reasoning for this was that if the BBC ever found itself in a state where no one ever used any of its services, then the case for the universal licence fee would be severely undermined. Therefore, we had to provide the large number of listeners at low cost, which justified the existence of Radio 3, which had very small numbers at a high cost. During the early days of Radio 1, my predecessor Derek Chinnery and then I had a lot less competition, and it wasn't surprising that we had such huge audiences. There was, after all, little alternative radio for listeners to choose. For those listeners living today who are aged between 40 and 60, in your youth, we provided the soundtrack to your lives. Today it's all different. The BBC Trust have objectives that relate to delivering quality first, which means serving the youth audience in ways that are not fulfilled by any other sector of broadcasting. In practice, this means catering for the youth audience with more specialist shows and reflecting on air the sort of music that your mother probably wouldn't like. Inevitably, if you target the youth audience only, then your listening figures will decline. In practical terms, one of the first results of this management objective was that Ben Cooper got rid of the breakfast show main man, Chris Moyles. This despite the fact that he was hugely popular and attracted a huge audience. Chris has been replaced by Nick Grimshaw, a more credible DJ in terms of the music, but with far less entertaining chat between the records. As a direct result of this, the Radar audience figures show that Radio 4 now has more listeners at breakfast time than Radio 1. It's also different from my day, but then if I, as an old-age pensioner, found myself enjoying Radio 1, I'd have to say they've got it wrong. It's not meant to appeal to people of my age. It's something of a BBC tradition that all senior managers have several responsibilities over and above their main role. When I was running Radio 1, I had to look after other BBC projects too. The worldwide launch and promotion of the radio data system, RDS, was my responsibility. Incidentally, this kept me travelling so much I earned the name the Remote Controller. Andy Parfitt too was given all kinds of extra managerial roles in radio and television, including the salvation of the BBC Radio Asian network. And now Ben Cooper finds himself in charge of Radio 1 Extra, the BBC digital station reflecting black music. This too organises and broadcasts many club events here and in Mallorca, highlighting the dance scene. Between Radio 1 and 1 Extra, the two stations try to cater for the musical tastes of all young people in the UK. Only Annie Nightingale from the original team is still on the air. What a survivor she is. When I look at the present DJ lineup, I don't recognise many of the names. But a number of my stars are still on the air, this time on Radio 2, Tony Blackburn, Steve Wright, Bob Harris and Johnny Walker, to name but four, so it's clear you can't keep real talent off the air. Others like Mark Goodyear, Simon Bates, Kid Jensen and Andy Peebles are also broadcasting, but on commercial radio. Commercial radio has benefited too, not just from the influx of talent, but from the Radio 1 specialisation policy, and they have gained audiences as Radio 1 has declined. Radio 1 still operates a playlist for the daytime shows and presents more specialist music programmes and documentaries in the evening, but all the music is much more youth-oriented. Rap, hip-hop, house, drum and bass and so on. The Radio 1 Roadshow also disappeared after 27 years of promotional service. That had a huge family appeal, but it's been replaced by the Big Weekend, concentrating on one area with all kinds of specialist music. And they also run Radio 1 Switch Live. These shows are staged in large theatres for younger audience, more evidence of the targeting of a specific age group. There's so much more radio now and more ways of accessing the music, so I guess the days when millions listen to their favourite station have gone forever. What Radio 1 has delivered in its place is different. It's younger, and for the dedicated listener it's probably a lot more satisfying, so I wish them good luck, even if I personally don't much care for the sounds. Chapter 23. The Present State of Radio in the UK. As we come to the end of this story of Radio 1, I thought it worthwhile to look at the state of all popular music radio in the UK. Everything is changing so quickly, and that's having an impact on radio stations, the music they play, and the way we listen. Conventional network radio, as I worked on it, is under threat. More and more people choose to listen to what they want, when they want it, from downloads onto iPods, iPhones, iPads, via the satellite, over the internet, or even from the BBC's own iPlayer website. There, anyone can choose to replay their favourite programme. Entertainment on demand is the slogan, and that threatens to make the old-fashioned programme controller obsolete. New methods of delivery like DAB won't really provide the answer. It's not universally available, particularly in cars, and good old FM sets never seem to wear out, so unless these new digital stations offer exclusive entertainment, which is only available on DAB, there's little incentive to buy a new radio. With the Eurozone crisis, many broadcasters can't afford the capital costs of putting in DAB transmitters. Even the DAB system itself is under threat from a superior system called DAB+, and there seems little agreement across Europe as to which system will be universal. In the UK we have DAB, while in Germany it's DAB+, and many radios won't decode both. In any case, all the indications are that those who take up this new technology are men aged under 35 with large disposable incomes, not the mass audience. In terms of technology, then, I'm somewhat pessimistic about the future of conventional popular music radio as it has been for the last 50 years. In content, too, there's much about which to be concerned. While the BBC has soldiered on with its 4 original national networks, it has also added Radio 6 Music, Radio 5 Live, Radio 5 Live Sports Extra, Radio 4 Extra, the Asian Network, and Radio 1 Extra, as well as their English local radio stations and the national regions. But even in English local radio there's doom and gloom, because BBC local radio has to bear its share of budget cuts. Consequently, what was the last bastion of truly local radio will soon disappear, as these BBC local stations will carry common programming networked across all of them during the evenings. What a pity. The commercial radio sector too has merged and consolidated in an appalling manner. Under the old radio authority, no local area was allowed to operate more than one station with the same format of music. The result, as you drove up and down the country, was a real variation in local news and music. Ofcom, the body that controls broadcasting in the UK now, has relaxed the ownership and content rules, and what was once a chain of very individual local stations have now come under the corporate umbrellas of several large conglomerates, and business is their main raison d'etre. It's a money-making operation. Operating costs are pruned to the minimum, and instead of broadcasting locally to their communities with music of their choice, the stations are programmed remotely with playlists dictated by music research. Personally, I deplore this reliance on research to choose records. Whatever happened to the DJ or programmer with a good pair of ears? The person who couldn't wait to get into the studio so that he or she could share this great piece of music with the listeners? Sadly, it's all gone. Instead, we have universal blandless FM, not so much with DJs with individual character as automatons. Here is, that was, here's a jingle with the name of the station, and here's another commercial. How sad is that? Where are the opportunities for the next generation of Kenny Everetts, Roger Scott, Neil Fox, Steve Penk, or Chris Moyles? Can you name me one independent local radio DJ who is allowed to sound like an individual today? Looking at the latest app for listening to radio on tablet, the Radio Player, I found capital FM stations in Birmingham, Derbyshire, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leicester, London, Manchester, Nottinghamshire, South Coast, South Wales, Teesside, Tyne and Wear, Yorkshire East and Yorkshire South. And that's just the output from one group. It's a huge money-making machine. There are 36 Heart stations, 8 Magics, and so it goes on with the following large media groups owning most of the independent radio stations in the UK: Bauer, Orion, GMG, Global and Absolute. Though that last one, Absolute, has concentrated on spreading the DAB word, and they have 78% of their listeners tuning to them on DAB, compared to the industry average of 31%. There it is then, a rather depressing picture of radio today in the UK. Maybe there are a new generation of listeners who just haven't got the habit of radio. In my youth we grew up listening to the wireless, but now there is so much more on offer. We see people everywhere walking around with their headsets on, so clearly plenty of people are still listening to something, but what? My guess is that a lot of the listening is to music that they've downloaded, so they're not dictated to by the radio station programmers with their research music. It could be argued that by this arrogant approach the radio people have brought this lack of interest on themselves. So, in conclusion, perhaps I should just put my feet up, tune to Radio 4 and consider that I've now become one of those boring old farts deploring the fact that things just ain't what they used to be. Radio 1, The Inside Scene, was read by Johnny Beerling and was produced by John Evington. The additional voice was that of Susan Beerling.